Hello, and welcome to Cranfield University. My name is Andrey Pavlov, and I'm Professor of Strategy and Performance here. And today in the studio with me, I've got Dr. Jean Boulton. Jean, welcome. Welcome back to Cranfield.
Thank you.
And we're talking about complexity. And Jean, I'm going to start with a very broad and very general question. So what is complexity?
Yes. Well, it's funny you should ask me that. In some ways, it's a difficult question to answer because on the one hand, if I asked my mum what complexity was, she would describe things being very, messy and uncertain, and we're trying to solve complex problems. You're living in a world you can't control and define, and it sounds like a bad thing. What complexity theory is trying to do in a way is to understand the nature of that complexity in such a way that we can gain some insight of how to kind of live and work effectively in that complex world. So it's also the source of novelty, adaptability, creativity, change, and in largely it's something we can't do without. The kind of core conditions for complexity, if I can put it that way, are to think about elements. So elements might be aspects of an ecology like plants and animals, or they might be people, or a mixture of both. But these elements will be diverse, both in the sense of that there might be different types of things that are interacting. And in our world, in some ways, they might be at different levels. We might be talking about, individuals interacting with each other, but in the context of an organization or something else. So it's elements that are diverse, and indeed can kind of change and grow and develop and learn in general.
So you're saying not only are they diverse, but they're also malleable, right? They can change through the interactions.
In the broadest sense of it. They're also interconnected, interwoven in ways that are complex and reflexive. And by reflexive, I mean, for example, in the way that we're interacting here. You're affecting me and I'm affecting you. There's a kind of, there's a feedback, to use that word, between us. So there's a reflexivity in this kind of complex situation where things are interacting and engaging back. And if we had 5 people here, well, we'd all be interacting in different ways with each other. So they're the two first conditions for complexity. And then the third one, which I think sometimes goes out of focus, is the need for kind of openness and interconnection with the wider world, which allows energy exchange, information exchange, and resource exchange for things to kind of come in and out of that situation. So there's a kind of energizing of the situation that can that's an important aspect of complexity. So they're the kind of conditions for complexity, and out of that we're really interested in what can we then learn and say about the nature of the complex world, which helps us to then function effectively within it.
Right. And so for me to kind of sum it up, these conditions would be, so that's the multiplicity of elements. So the fact that there are multiple things.
Yes, diverse things. Yeah.
They're diverse. So that's the second thing. They're interconnected. They're interconnected in a reflexive way, you're saying. So through these interconnections, through the interactions, they change.
Yes.
And this whole pattern, this whole set of interactions is open to the outside world.
Yes. Yeah.
And what you're saying is that seeing, just for me to kind of parrot it back to you,
sure.
Seeing complexity in that way allows us to say something about the complex world, to say something about complexity, rather than just say, well, it's complex and there's nothing we can do about it.
Yes, it's bad and I don't know what to do. So then, we can discuss at some point the kind of the attributes of that that complexity and how that can guide us and how we can understand the nature of the complex world. So it's a kind of, to use that word, it's an ontological perspective. It's we're describing, we're interested in the nature of how things are and how things change, and we're that kind of that worldview, to use a slightly different word, is important. You know, how we understand the world that we live in is important because it affects how we engage with it. You know, how we design organisations and interventions and so on. So it's kind of, you know, it's an important thing. One thing I'd quite like to add as well is that these elements don't have to be discrete. So we can
talk more about it.
It's harder to model, so sometimes it kind of falls off the radar, but we're not ignoring, you know, kind of atmosphere or mood or culture or more diffuse aspects of the world in what we're describing. We don't have to leave those out.
I think that's quite an important point. So it's not just the discrete elements, as you're saying, but it's also something that is less easily definable, but still has agency, for lack of a better word.
Exists. Yes.
Yeah, it still exists. Okay, I can immediately see what you say about the fact that it's difficult to model this kind of stuff.
But you know, but that's a whole, you know, other topic. The difference between what we learn about the complex world through modelling and how we learn things in different ways through being in it, and also through sometimes what we gain from the biological and physical sciences.
So I do want to ask you about the attributes of complexity that you've just mentioned, and I do want to ask you about the ontological change that this worldview kind of requires.
Yes.
But before we get into this, can I just ask you about the kind of intellectual provenance of these ideas?
Yes.
What's the history of these ideas?
Yes.
Where are they coming from? Who's informing them?
Yes, yeah. Well, that's quite a long answer, but I feel that the real starting point for this was you know, Darwin and evolution in the mid-19th century, which really did have a huge impact on both science and philosophy and economics and all sorts of things. You know, very interesting early paper by Veblen called, you know, why isn't economics an evolutionary science, and so on. It really blew people's minds, and the reason being that science before then was a kind of had a kind of Platonic ideal, really. So Newton's science was really saying, you know, there is a machine, you know, it's objectively there, we know how it works, you know, we've got a few details, you know, to fill in, but you know, science is about predictability, universality,
order, structure,
you know, all that, you know, we have to find it, but it's there. Now, what Darwin was saying, and his work was a science in the sense that there's a universality and an objectivity about the mechanism, and obviously our understanding of the mechanism of it has changed, but broadly, Darwin was bringing in the fundamental importance of diversity and variation. That without variation, that it's through variation that things can change, evolve. That something changes in a situation, in a particular pond. You know, at 2:30 on a Tuesday, a new frog is born with longer legs. You know, is that an advantage or is it a disadvantage? If it's an advantage, then the frog, you know. So for example, if the frog can, with its longer legs, can reach flies that fly higher up on the reeds than his brothers and sisters, then he's going to, you know, get the girl and
realize competitive advantage.
Yes, you know, and have that advantage. And it's a kind of, it's not an optimal advantage, it's a local advantage. It may not even last, you know, if the food supply it becomes worse the following year, and you know, the reeds don't grow so high, and the brothers and sisters who are not as big, you know, can get the flies lower down, then the larger frog with longer legs won't you know, that change won't survive. So there's something about the importance of diversity and variation, which was a first philosophically, really blew people's minds. There's also something about it being local. And the third thing is we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know nothing, but because there's a kind of path dependency about evolution. You know, if animals have got 2 eyes and 4 legs, then there's something set that kind of sustains in many ways. But there's a kind of idea of emergence and unknown. So now we have a science that says we understand a universality about the mechanism, but we don't know what's going to happen, and it will be different in different places. So
what strikes me about what you just said is that the kind of classical science would take the what as given and then look for the answers to how. But what you're saying with Darwin science and with evolutionary science, the answer, we can approach the answers to the how, but we have no idea what will happen, where it will happen, when it will happen.
Yes, or not, no idea, because that's kind of part of it. But there's a kind of envelope of possibilities, but we don't know which and when and how within those. But it isn't like anything could happen. It is it's constrained by history and context. So this kind of evolutionary perspective, which really, it's so interesting to, I think to look at how that really impacted philosophical thinking through William James and Peirce pragmatism, process philosophy, and the hard sciences. And where Prigogine comes into this story is he writes in his autobiography when he got the Nobel Prize, which I think was 1976, how he was entranced as a young man by reading Henri Bergson's work on creative evolution. And Henri Bergson was part of this kind of process philosophy tradition with James and Peirce. And there's a question that Bergson raises in his book, which is why does life mount the incline that matter descends? And what he meant by that was evolution shows us that things can evolve into more sophisticated forms. They don't always, incidentally, evolve into more sophisticated forms, but they can. So we start with, simple cells and amoeba, and we end up with, mammals and the great, humankind. So that's what life does. But physics had basically two sorts of theories. One of them was the machine theory, Newton's theory, which applies to, largely to small discrete elements interacting, which work like a machine. So if you apply Newton's ideas to the larger world, you're kind of looking at this machine. We know everything about it. It's determined by its starting point. It tootles along, and we can know everything about it. So that's one kind of image, the mechanical worldview that came into science. And then the other science, the science of thermodynamics, the science of liquids and gases, which developed a century later, was really saying things reach an equilibrium. So all this kind of messiness and both of these theories, interestingly, applied to closed systems, closed situations. So you've got in a way you've got a choice if you want to apply this to the social world. One of them is everything finds an equilibrium, which the economists liked, and the other one is we can predict everything, which the management liked. So what Prigogine recognised, and I sometimes say he got the Nobel Prize for one word, which was if you look at situations that are open to their wider environment, you can get a reversal of this idea of equilibrium systems in the end up as featureless dust. We talk about entropy increasing, but locally in an open situation, entropy can reverse, and you can get this kind of emergence of form and structuring, which is the same as what you find in evolution, which is also a kind of local phenomenon.
So presumably also partly dependent on history, but not altogether predictable.
Yes, so it's shaped but not determined by history and context. So Prigogine brought physics and biology together around this word open, and it's quite an interesting story, because as you know, he was Russian born but lived in Belgium. His family emigrated to Belgium, so he spoke French and Russian. And there was a very interesting work going on in the 1950s in Russia, the Belousov-Sabotinsky reaction, which people couldn't believe at the time, which showed that in certain conditions that a chemical system could display these emerging patterns and swirls that people almost like couldn't believe they were seeing. And it was because it was an open system, it was actually being energized. And it's a bit like, I sometimes use the analogy of, you know, back in the day when we had Gaelic coffees and they were very, very popular. You had hot coffee and you had, you know, the air which was cooler, and on the cream on the top, you could sometimes see almost like swirls emerging. So that was, he was seeing that in a chemical system. He was a physical chemist, and then recognizing that it was this energizing, this openness to the wider context that was allowing these forms to emerge out of chaos, as one of his books was called Order Out of Chaos. So it was where the biological and the physical understanding came together in one fell swoop. So that was very, very interesting. So that was a long answer to one of the traditions that came into complexity. And that Prigogine, in a sense, engaged with von Bertalanffy, who was
it's kind of the father of the systems thinking.
General systems theory. Yeah. Now, he was a biologist.
Bertalanffy.
Yes, von Bertalanffy was a biologist, and his book brought together a range of traditions. But it's quite interesting that there's been a strong kind of physics tradition into this, and a biological tradition. And the biological tradition in particular emphasizes this idea that through this kind of open engagement with its context, natural systems can sustain, and there's a sort of teleological pull to stability and existence. Now, whether it's teleological, you know, whether it's kind of drawn towards that, I think is kind of an interesting question, because in a sense, you know, biological systems that don't find a balance die.
Yes. So we don't know.
So they died. You know, so the ones that sustain. So it gives an emphasis in the biological tradition, which is continued on with people like Kaufman and Brian Goodwin and earlier Maturana and Varela. There's a kind of emphasis on two things: on the life cycle, which we've used in Embracing Complexity, to look at the life cycle of the forest and what that means for organisations and you know, broader systems. And there's an emphasis on this idea of balancing, which I find is less emphasized in the kind of physics tradition. So that's really one. It's been the tradition that really interests me, and it's kind of beyond or before modelling, because it really emphasizes the importance of the messiness. So you know, I can talk about that if you like, the kind of difference between the kind of modelling tradition.
I'm sure, we'll get to this.
Yes,
as well,
So that's been my tradition, and it's, you know, as you know, I'm a physicist by background, and I found that very compelling, and the fact that what we're saying with this is things are not knowable. There's a kind of level of uncertainty, and it's more than. It's too complicated to know. There's something intrinsically complex about the world that makes it not knowable. There used to be the idea of a demon in outer space, you know,
yes, the Laplace's demon.
Laplace's demon, that would have a brain big enough to know everything. But in a way, what this is saying is that even Laplace's demon couldn't know. It's not an epistemological problem. It's an ontological description, a description about the nature of things that make things complex in ways that what emerges cannot be known in advance, because that knowledge doesn't exist in any way. So that's a more profound statement that not everyone would agree with, but that's certainly what I take from this kind of work in Prigogine, and laced a little bit with some other sciences too.
How did you get into it with your background as a physicist?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I was working as in a kind of engineering consultancy. So I did physics. I did a PhD in quantum physics, and I eventually ended up doing technical consultancy and worked in an engineering consultancy. And some of the AI guys at the time, we just about got enough computing power. This is in the, the 1980s. And you'd walk past somebody's desk and there'd be this kind of plotting of these kind of weird things that was very intriguing. And there was a lot of kind of interest and popular books coming out called Complexity and Chaos and things at that time that I found intriguing, having a science background. And I moved from engineering consultancy into management consultancy, and was really kind of interested in what can you really do? A lot of management consultancy seems quite formulaic. So you come in with the answer or the method.
Framework.
Yes, this
exactly.
is the framework, and we'll apply this, and it will work here. And I moved into being quite a senior manager in an aerospace company for a while. And so I was applying these things and in a sense finding it wasn't like that, that the context, the history, the diversity, the politics just made...
They were decisive, right?
Yes, that made a difference to how... So you had to engage with the complexity of the situation. So when I came across complexity thinking back in the 1980s, it sort of married, in a sense, my physics background and my interest in the social world and management. So I started thinking about it and writing about it a bit. And because I did my MBA at Cranfield in the late 1980s, we're probably talking about the 1990s now, I eventually came across Peter Allen here. I came to give a talk in the strategy group. And somebody said, "Oh, you don't know these guys, do you? Let me introduce you to Peter Allen." And it was like a match made in heaven for me. And I started to come here as independently, and eventually started to work with Peter and his team, and came on the staff here.
And of course, Peter used to work with Ilya Prigogine as well.
Yeah, so Peter was also a theoretical physicist, and was in a sense was perhaps struggling to explain his ideas to a more, he'd slightly bizarrely ended up in the management school as a theoretical physicist and talked a lot about fisheries, and people would go, he just goes on with examples about fishing, and I was in a better position to kind of marry the two worlds, I think, and I found I was passionately interested in it from then on, from the late 1980s and into the 1990s, and I'm as passionate and interested and engaged with it now as I ever was. I feel
that's a good sign.
Yeah. And the reason being, I feel that our worldview allows us to make many mistakes in the world. That to think things are predictable and controllable when they're not is a real mistake. It means that we don't do a good job of engaging with climate change because of our worldview. We try and make things predictable, measurable when they're not, or we have to be more sophisticated about the way we measure impact and those kind of things. So it feels like, pretending the world is not embracing complexity when the world is complex doesn't allow us to be efficient or effective, and assuming simplicity or linearity or
predictability,
control or predictability when it isn't there doesn't make it true. So it for me, it isn't an option. It's just like, if we can explain this, not just to say, it's complex, get over it, but what does that mean? How do we engage better? What are the attributes of the complex world? Then we do a better job. And
that's actually a perfect segue into what I was going to ask you next.
Yeah.
So what are the attributes of the complex world? So we've said complexity. Complexity means a number of elements, not necessarily discrete, but a number of elements that are interacting. Through their interactions, they're changing, and this whole situation is open to the outside forces, to the outside world. Right. So if we look at this situation in that way, so what do we see? How does it behave? What do we expect?
So one of the things that we notice about the world in general is that it becomes patterned. So what do I mean by patterned? Well, if I walk into an organization, there will be certain ways of working and cultural norms that I can kind of attune to and pick up and examine in a variety of ways. There will be ways of doing things. If I go to visit a family as opposed to this family, there will be norms and interactions, ways of doing things, but more than that, there will be dynamics that settle down. So, if you've got 4 children, who's close to whom, who focuses in on mum, who focuses in on dad, who goes to bed first, how do decisions get made? There will be norms and patterns that can become relatively stable. So
some sort of regularity in how these interactions take place.
Yes, and they've evolved, they've self-organized, to use that word, through repeating patterns, through power sometimes, through things that get settled down, and they become so normal that other people in other families, they just regard it as the way all families would be to some extent. So we get attuned to our geographical cultures or our organizational cultures, ways of working, ways of doing things, and there may be formal parts of that, but the informal networks that go on in organizations would be part of that patterning. So we're interested in patterning, and what I would say systems thinkers focus on more, and these are all nobody would entirely disagree with anybody, but there's sometimes a feeling like if we can just get to grips with these patterns, then we'll know how to act.
And I've noticed that you've mentioned the word, or you've mentioned the term pattern rather than a system.
Yes.
And I'm presuming this is a conscious choice.
Yes, because the interest in understanding the wider world is, if we start talking about things as systems, we kind of, they sound like they're a thing, so
with boundaries and with structure.
Yes, and something you can kind of look at and measure. But what are the important boundaries of situations? So if you look at an ecology, you could say, well, that's a complex situation. It's relatively stable, over time. In the wood where I walk my dog near where I live, there are yew trees, there's wild garlic, those things of an ivy. If I go down the road, then sometimes for not particularly good reasons, there's a whole different ecology. It's not very far away, but it's got bluebells and wood anemones. My wood doesn't, and some of that is because a bird dropped something, or there were particular conditions under particular trees that the conditions resulted in bluebells blooming there, and then once they've got settled in the ecology, then they tend to stay. So there are patterns in that way. But if I call it a system, what are the boundaries of that? Well, I can't define it in advance. It may be that things become less important to the ecology of the wood the further you get out. But boundaries are something you have to learn about as opposed to impose. And even when you talk about an organisation as a system, what do you include in the organisation? It might be you have some very dominant customers or dominant suppliers who are actually calling the tune and making what happens there happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And for example, here, the example that I always use is that technically our students are our customers.
Yes.
But actually they come here, they live with us, they spend the whole year with us.
Yes.
They have IDs just like we do.
Yes.
And they massively influence our thinking and our research and how we think about the world.
Yes.
And so it's almost impossible to separate them from the Cranfield as a organization.
Yes. Yeah. So part of the modelling tradition, which kind of exacerbates this, is if you're going to model something, you have to define boundaries and you have to decide what's in it. Now, you might be right that you've got all the important ingredients in it, but you might not be right. So if you think about this as a worldview, my interest then is first of all, to go back to the attributes, is like, what are the patterns that have emerged? and how do I kind of engage with those, and understanding. So when people go, well, you know, if the world's this complex, I can't know everything. Are you telling me I've got to know everything before I can move? No, I'm saying, how do we understand and engage with and investigate what patternings are relatively stable at the moment, and that stability is held through this self-regulating, self-organizing, reflexive process. So it isn't like a thing. It isn't like I've put in a leader, you know, I've put in these processes for, you know, measuring innovation. I might do that, but the patternings that emerge, we'll see those as inputs, we'll see those as aspects of it. But what emerges, you know, how decisions actually get made, will emerge and self-organize in this system. You know, the leadership will have an impact, but it won't get what it wants necessarily. So that's the first thing. There's something about engaging with patterns, and I think systems thinkers feel like if we could only get to grips with the patterns, we kind of know more or less what we need to know to operate. Where complexity has a different emphasis, complexity thinkers, is they see this as a dynamic, as a processual issue. So we're interested not just in what patterns are there, but how they have emerged and in what might change them. So the interest, and something Peter Allen felt was a real contribution he made, was to do with how things can invade. He used that word, invade patterns. So there's something we talked about in Embracing Complexity, she says, waving this book around, which is to do with the dance between pattern and events, we called it, but pattern and diversity. So we see things, a word that Prigogine uses, things are always in a process of becoming. So things can stabilize for a time, but our interest should be, it'll be attuned to, when are things very stable, sometimes too stable, they lose their diversity and get really locked in. But what is unraveling? Where are new patterns emerging? Where are some patterns starting to dissolve? And how do we intervene in that? You know, do we want to sustain certain patterns, or do we want to support new patterns, or what? You know, what is it that we're trying to do?
So seeing patterns as essentially processual, that may be temporarily stable, but actually they're always in a state of flux, so to speak, even though they might display temporary stability.
Yes, so there's a processual dynamic view, and we've got to be attuned to, and this is one of the paradoxes, or the issues, is we've got to both ask what are the patterns that are relatively stable, because that gives us a lot of information about our world, and
what is going to destroy them as well.
Yes, and what, or you know, develop new ones, or in what ways do we intervene? So we have to look at some particularity. So another P word, I've got into P words at the moment. There's something about particularity. We have to be interested in the detail. Which detail? Well, I don't know, but I've got to be attuned to change. I've got to notice. I may have to work with both hard data and soft data. I may need multiple perspectives, but I've got to notice change, and I've got to have a sense in my intervening sometimes is, where do I go in there? You know, where is it? Where do I go in there, rather than, you know?
Yeah. So would it be accurate then to say that even in a apparently stable pattern, there would be kind of pockets where, or places that would be more amenable to change than other places, and so you would look for them and you would intervene there.
Yeah, and that sounds more kind of you know, doable than it sounds like, you know, I'll just sit here and look for where to intervene. But in you know, we're dealing with interlocking patterns. You know, there will be hierarchical power patterns, patterns of how power is shared. There'll be patterns. There'll be social patterns. You know, who socializes together. How do decisions get made that way? You know, there's interwoven patterns. I use the word because I don't want to reify it. So there's something about patterns. There's something about the dynamics, the process that we're interested in. There's something about this idea of variation and diversity. So we're interested, you know, that diversity matters. When we start to lose that diversity, we lose the ability of situations to adapt to changing situations, circumstances, to respond, you know, to be resilient. So there's something about that diversity and messiness that even though the patterns may become relatively stable and have meso-level characteristics that are kind of fairly well identifiable, we can define what those, you know, like what do I mean?
What would that look like?
Yeah. So if you take the cultural web or something, you know, we can say these are some words that describe the culture, but the truth is that within all that and underneath that, you know, there'll be variation within the organisation, and there'll be places where it's changing and has changed. Bits are dying, you know, bits are getting stronger, and so on. So there's something about understanding the sensitivity to history and context that we need to understand in the attributes of a complex system.
So we've got patterning. We've got talking about your piece, right? We've got particularity. You mentioned process. Would that be one of them?
Yes, yeah. Processual. And I'm just there's something about what because I wanted a P word. There's something about the potency of complex situations that new things can emerge. So new things don't always emerge, but you know, there's something about the characteristics of the situation and things that might come from the outside too.
And when you say new, you mean radically new, or?
I mean radically new. So self-organisation can sometimes be thought of as rearranging the deck chairs to get new qualities, but emergence, in the way that I would describe it, is really to do with something radically new that's never been seen before, that's changed things. So
what would that look like?
So it might be something like text messaging, which was you know, a new innovation in a sense, which radically changed the way people parent their children, the way we communicate, the way business is done. Social anxiety, you know, it changed the business model of mobile phones. You know, there was a pull from the consumer, which meant that the whole modelling of mobile phones and what they were used for and how they were, you know, how they costed, their cost models completely changed. So there was we wouldn't have known before anybody invented text messaging that it would have such a radical effect. We couldn't have imagined that. It was kind of an unknown. So an emergence is in a sense of an unknown. You get things that, as Schilling, who was a modeler, a complexity modeler, said, is, you know, I'd like you to write a list of the things that have never occurred to you. And
that's what you mean by radical emergence.
Yes, yeah. It's just like it couldn't have been known, or it would be very difficult to have imagined what text messaging could have done to our social patternings and our business and cultural patternings.
So I see what you mean by the potency of the system.
Yes, yeah.
So to be able to produce a disproportionate new big thing.
Yes, yeah. And sometimes when organisations become too efficient and they want to clone people,
they lose the capacity for that.
Yes, yeah. So there's something about emergence and potency, and then two more in this list. And I want to say this list is systemic. It isn't like you pick and choose. I'm trying to describe in some sort of systemic way the characteristics of complex situations that should help us to function. Another one that is paradoxical.
Talk more about this.
Yes. So what we'd like to feel in a scientific worldview and in a professional worldview is that there is a right answer. You know, there is a right way of doing things. You know, it's where the management consultancies that came in with, you know,
my framework. Yeah.
Yes, this framework. You know, it didn't necessarily, it said this is the way to do change. It didn't say, well, where are you at now? You know, what kind of change processes have you got? You know, where are your strengths and weaknesses?
Well, they would do some diagnostics.
Yes, but it was still a bit like, you know, this is the way you do it. The paradox in complex situations is by and large, there's no absolute right answer. There's no right way of doing things. There isn't an answer to be found. We are trying to find, although I want to caveat this, some kind of middle ground. So, you know, should this organisation be more, is the problem here that this organisation is too chaotic and it needs more structure? Or is the problem that this organisation has become too bureaucratic and it needs some loosening up? You know, does it, you know, that's a kind of, you know, paradoxical question. And often what happens with organisations is they kind of move between the two. It's the same, if you like, with political systems. You know, do we want something that's very community led, that really emphasises community values, or are we really focusing on the individual? Well, we kind of want a bit of both. You know, there's room for individuality, but we also have to take care of, you know, our communities, our organisations, the wider context, in order to function in the long term. Just
to kind of push. Yeah, I was thinking. Yeah.
Oh, he's going to challenge me now.
Just to kind of push this point, would it be accurate to say that maybe today and here we want this particular thing? So there is the right answer for my situation, and then when it changes, there's a different right answer. Or are you saying that it's actually not useful to think about it in terms of right and wrong answers?
No, well, I think that's a good point. So yes, I think that's right. If I was working with this organisation here, I might be concluding, you know, in my diagnostic that what's needed here is a bit more structure, or the structure needs to change to bring some more you know, autonomous, systemic kind of working at a more local level, closer to the market. So I would be homing in on that, but it isn't a universal right answer. It's a contextual right answer, and it will have, if ultimately, the downside of the bit that you're moving away from. So one of my ways of working with complexity in the real world, you know, in practical ways, is always to say, well, I'm beginning to home in on this, but what's missed out from that? You know, so what's the opposite of what I'm thinking? Where is there some value in the opposite? So here I'm thinking, you know, we need more honesty in this conversation, more authenticity. So what's the downside of that? What would it do? So working with paradox is always to kind of say, well, I'm feeling pretty certain that at this moment in time, this is a good starting point, but how do I stay attuned to what I'm leaving out by doing that, and where is it heading? You know, a bit too far over there and a bit too far away from there.
Why is doing this important? Is it because you can get locked in a particular pattern, or why is being sensitive to the paradoxical nature of this important?
Because it helps you to notice, be attuned to what's being ignored and how things change. So it's if you keep saying, you know, there's no absolute right answer, it first of all stops you getting consultants in who have the right answer and go, just do this and it'll work. So you're always saying, well, what's right here for now? And it's a sort of feeling that there's always some truth in the opposite of what you're doing. There's something that you're missing. So as a kind of practice, thinking of things as not being easily determined and defined. So it shouldn't stop you acting. I think that's important. It isn't going, well, I don't know, you know, I can't make sense of this. You know, what I remember years ago, somebody coming up with the phrase, instead of thinking of ready, aim, fire, we should sometimes do ready, fire, aim. In other words, we sometimes have to experiment. We have to try, you know, that can sound a scary word, but we do our best. We do a diagnostic. We get our best judgment. We work with many people and many perspectives. We work with hard data. I'm not, you know, at all against hard data. This isn't just a kind of woolly approach. I'm a scientist background. I studied physics. You know, it's got hard data in it, so nothing against that. But then we say, well, let's set off here, but let's recognise that something will be missing. Things will emerge that we didn't expect. You know, how do we stay loose at the same time as making progress? and that's a paradox. There are lots of kind of paradox about we need to act, but we need to act with some humility, you know.
Because I suppose the voices or the interests that you leave out with time could actually develop into something that you will have to deal with.
Yes, or you know, or the world changes, you know, or there's new competition, or we just didn't expect this consequence of what we were doing. But staying attuned to that, you know. So for example, one of the things that some people talk about with self-organization, it became a kind of popular thing to talk about self-organizing teams, leaderless teams. Now, for me, that's going to this end of things. So there's nothing wrong with leadership. You have to think about the nature of leadership for this context, and you know, what does that mean? And you will have forms of leadership, you know, even if they're, you know, they're about, you know, who says what to who in the pub. You know, there will be things going on. So I don't think that, you know, it's like regulation. I don't believe that complexity is saying, you know, trust the market or trust, you know, the leaderless team, you know, that good will emerge. It has this idea of that you get from overplaying the biological metaphor, that things will naturally come good. I think that what complexity shows sometimes is how the powerful get more powerful, you know, how the big get bigger. You know, there can be a kind of positive feedback loop in that sense. So there's a place for leadership, there's a place for regulation, there's a place for pulling back on some of those things, so that you get a kind of balance. But you're always playing around with, well, what's too much regulation? Well, what's too much leadership? What kind of leadership do we need here in this context? So it does make those issues of judgment more, you know, more issues of paradox, if you want to use that word, more
very anti-ideological, I would say. So it almost says that there are no universals, right? And
yes.
Very critical in the good sense of the word.
Yes, and that where you might try and get universals, because you can't, you know, you might say, well, you know, we can't have every hospital, you know, being run differently, but how do you get some kind of commonality through sharing learning, through engaging with good practice, or indeed bad practice? So you can bring together communities and say, well, what would work in our situation? You know, I can take a bit of that idea, I can try that out, I can do this. But because we have different histories, we're in different parts of the country. If you take hospitals, we've got a different clientele, you know, their age and demography and issues are different. Then how do we get principles of best practice, you know, but allow some of the how to be more, you know, locally and contextually evolved. So that's a kind of paradoxical issue. And then the final P in my desire to have P's for this is punctuated, and it's really reminding us that in complex situations, change is not linear. We can have a kind of mindset about incremental change, and what this is saying is that sometimes things get stuck and locked in and stay the same whatever you do for an awfully long time, and sometimes things really change on the head of a pin and can either collapse or, you know, take off.
Mushroom into something.
Yes, very, very quickly. So we have to be attuned to that idea of change being, sometimes things are very stuck and sometimes they're very loose, and some of the work I think on diagnosing complex situations is to say, is this a very stuck, locked in situation where things are very tightly held? It feels like there's no breath here, you know, the relationships are very fixed, nobody can get in, nothing new can happen, and my intervention here is in some sense, you know, how do I breathe life into this, how do I chisel away into that? Or am I working in a very nascent, chaotic, emerging situation where perhaps my role is to cohere emerging shoots, you know, is to bring people together, is to provide a little structure, that sort of thing? Or am I in the middle of all this, in quite mature situations where there's still quite a lot of diversity, it's quite stable, and how do I kind of then work to harness that and support that kind of situation? So So that idea of understanding change as episodic, which was, another word you could use, as punctuated, is really.
Would you say it's not the way we normally think about change?
I would. I think we've been brought up, certainly in the West, to have a sort of mechanical worldview. So we are taught, that to be professional is to have a really good plan and implement it. There's a separation between, the plan and the implementation, the measurement. I sometimes used to feel, working as a management consultant, that people would want to ask how I was going to measure the success rather than how we were going to achieve success. It's almost like the tail wagging the dog. And I'm not saying you shouldn't be able to have some evidence that things have worked. I'm not saying that, but it's like the wrong end. So we work in this idea that to be professional, and people kind of know it's not like that. They kind of do things under the wire. Or they say, well, yes, I put my strategy in and now I'm going to, respond to the market. Yeah. I'm going to do what I do. Or, so there's a game played around professionalism and measurement and control. I was really struck by some people talking about being social workers and how, the system didn't learn. There's a lot of regulation for social workers, but the regulatory system didn't learn, because if you broke the rules, you had to hide it. So yes. If you were, there were certain protocols you had to follow. But if there's a really critical situation and you feel somebody might die, you might want to bend the rules, but then you have to hide it, so there's no feedback into the kind of process. So we both have this kind of machine view, and we have this kind of almost like psychological view that change is linear. And I think you saw that at the beginning of the pandemic, where some of the scientists were going, well, we're here now, but we're about to go here. This is going to change really quickly, guys. And the politicians going, well, yes, but, this is only little, this is a big deal.
Let's go with a measured response.
Yes, because what's in their head, in a way, is, well, it will be linear and then we can kind of act a bit later. And then by the time you act, it's kind of, it's done this. So we have a sort of it's the same with climate change, I feel, that the kind of, the exponential shift, the kind of irreversible change of things like that is not, we don't feel it psychically. We feel like if we have a little bit too much of it, it'll be okay, really, and we can pull back. So it does matter. And also it can be very difficult about evidence. One example I've used around this is a friend of mine who was involved used to run a charity where they dealt with disability in different countries, and she was being slightly ironic about it, but she was saying we've had to pull back from the countries that really need us. And I'm saying, well, what do you mean you've had to pull back from the countries that really need us? And she said, well, within the context of the project funding, if we start in a kind of greenfield site with this, we've just about, got the politicians and the powers that be to start thinking about this. We've got some ideas of some nascent projects. We've got some people who can champion this.
Presumably because the pattern hasn't locked in yet.
Yes, so what there's not even locked in, it hasn't kind of emerged at all, that they're just starting to, with these kind of gentle new shoots. And then there's nothing to show. You can't demonstrate anything concrete for that. So the funder goes, well, you haven't really done anything. And she said, it's always better to be the second agency to go in, because the second agency can then start to do things like measure how many wheelchairs or, how many law changes there've been, because they're building on this kind of, this very subtle emerging qualitative change. So, to understand change is punctuated matters, because when you then decide something's not working, or what you see as measures of success have to be different depending on that life cycle.
Yeah, I see what you mean, because the determinants of change, or the kind of the drivers of change, may be happening, but on the surface, nothing is observable.
Yes.
Until at some point it becomes observable.
Yes.
Or it could grow very quickly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So we might cut things too soon because we're looking for the wrong kind of measures, or we might reward the wrong people who kind of, you know, come in on the back of something. It's the same, you know, with performance management, isn't it? You know, that some people are lucky, you know, they move into the job at the right time.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you take a cynical view of this, then one of the lessons is that it's important to be at the right place at the right time.
You could, yes. Yeah.
Okay, so right, so we've got patterning, we've got the paradoxical nature, we've got particularities. So looking at the context,
we've got this dynamic, the processual.
The processual. We've got the potency, so the potential to create radical change. And am I missing something?
And the punctuated.
And the
punctuated. Yeah. So, and it sounds like a list, doesn't it? I mean, how do I put over these ideas without? But they're all interconnected and interwoven. You know, one creates the other. But having that worldview, sorry, but one of the things that people say is, well, you know, but so what do we do? Well, quite often you'll do what you did before, but with a broader perspective in mind. So
with a different mindset, and you could still use the same management instruments, and you still use the same indicators, for example, but you'll do it in a different way and for a different purpose.
Yes. So you might say, well, it's good to have a portfolio strategy because, you know, what we see as the optimal strategy with this view in mind, you know, may not work as well as we thought. So let's have other things in our portfolio. We might want to review more often, so that we can either deal with unexpected successes, which sometimes get lost if you have this kind of strategy and then the implementation. So are we attuned to, you know, actually those sales guys have homed in on something. They're sensing something in the environment and picking up, but because it's not part of our strategy, you know, we're killing it. So it means that you're still developing a strategy, you're still clarifying what you want people to do, but you'll review it more often, you'll take in more broader perspectives, you will expect some things to fail and not see that as a failure. You'll be prepared to change things, and you'll probably have some aspects of your portfolio that are slightly more sensing into the unknown. To try it out and see what happens. So that's what I mean. The same with performance management. You know, one of the questions I sometimes ask people is, so with complexity in mind, you know, you've got the performance management system, you can't change it. You know, HR have given you this, you've got to fill the boxes in. How can you use it slightly differently, you know, with complexity in mind? Well, you can review it more often with people. You can set more collective objectives.
Or you can, for example, decouple it from compensation, and use those measures for learning about what's going on, rather than for directing behavior in advance, you know, a priori.
Yes. But even if you want to, in a sense, direct the behavior, if you can review that more often, then you can kind of modify the importance of different objectives, or you can modify the objectives a bit, or you can set them in more of a group setting. You can use them, as you say, more developmentally. So you're doing the same thing, but you kind of you're approaching it with a different mindset. And I think, you know, I don't want people to feel in dealing with complexity, you're going, well, you know, we've got to start again. What are the tools? You know, there are tools, but this isn't really about tools. It's more about using the ways you would do things, but with a different mindset and with different expectations.
So this is quite helpful, right? So you're saying that complexity could mean a lot of things to a lot of people, and it could just mean complicatedness or a lot of things. But actually, we can look at it through these 4 or 5 elements that you mentioned: the diversity, the interconnection, the openness, and then what we see, these situations described through that lens, display a number of attributes, and we can actually work with those attributes quite usefully, in a useful way.
Yes. And I think some of it. So, you know, I would, if I go into a situation, I would be interested in getting to grips with the history and the patterning. So I would do a kind of, not just on my own, but I would want to spend time doing some kind of diagnostic, which might be at a regional level. You know, like how can a company work in this region? It might be at an organizational level, it might be a community, it might be a family. You know, I'm kind of I'm sure I'm an interesting guest sometimes, because I'm kind of, I'm interested. And there's something
You're diagnosing.
yeah, something like that. But there's something about history here that's really important. Some of the ways we try and do a diagnostic is to try and understand what is, as opposed to where things have come from. And it's not, I'm not just interested in where they've come from, but it's like the kind of the depth of the patterning. You know, if things have been this way in this region for centuries, then even if superficially they don't seem to be there, they probably are. You know, so
Yes.
you've talked about deep structures, I think, haven't you? And so we're interested in the history. We're interested in the kind of systemic, broad nature of things, and we're trying to home in on this kind of patterning, but trying to understand through looking at where things have come from, what's really deeply embedded here. You know, what's more superficial, and then how do we operate? So it might be useful to give an example. There's something called the Fragile States Index. It's something like that.
Okay.
And it's based on current measures. So it isn't a dynamic. It's kind of saying, does this country have schools, roads,
like a snapshot of indicators.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, to use I want to be slightly careful how I use an example, but imagine a country in the Middle East, which actually look pretty stable and not fragile. But if you looked at the history of the region, there were a number of things going on. So, for example, climate change was creating increasing drought in certain parts of the country. So people were migrating to the cities.
Over time, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
There was a dynamic to do with the popularity of. There had been a kind of socialist autocracy which took care of people. So there were lots of social safety nets that were designed by the government. But practice laissez-faire practices, deregulation meant that those were going. So you had a kind of political change, which meant that there weren't the safety nets at the same time as you've got an environmental change. At the same time as this area had oil, and that oil was beginning to fall out. And that's before we even get into the kind of the geopolitical significance of this particular country. So if you looked at those dynamics of those, if you looked at it on a social, economic, environmental, technological level, you started to see something that was potentially unraveling.
And then presumably when it would unravel, it would do it very quickly.
Yes.
So it's I suppose it's an illustration both of the processual nature of these situations, but also of this episodic, punctuated way of changing.
Yes, and the need for a diagnostic to be quite broad and systemic. You had to ask questions about the importance of this region for the wider world as well, and what was going on.
And 10 years back.
Yes, and 100 years back.
And maybe 100 years back.
You know, so this place I'm thinking of. For example, didn't have a history of ethnic conflict. It had a lot of different ethnic groups, but actually it was quite stable for a variety of reasons. Another region I did some work in was quite the opposite. That there'd been ethnic violence going back centuries. So it's good to know that when you're trying to intervene. Is this something where you can get people around the table, and there will be a natural tendency not to other, difference, to be able to work with different communities and diversities, or isn't there? So I'm interested in that kind of historical perspective.
That's really useful. And I suppose in the spirit of kind of clarifying this for me even more, can I just ask you about some other ways in which people have talked about complexity? So, for example, as you know, this is a hot topic, especially now, and you hear quite a lot of terms and quite a lot of words thrown around, and people say, well, complexity, complex systems, complexity theory, complex adaptive systems, chaos theory, fractals, you name it. Give me some kind of clarity here. Are they all related? Are they all the same? Can you mix them?
No, a good question. So I've been talking about this kind of broad tradition in complexity that comes from physics and biology.
So this is the Darwin, Bertalanffy, Prigogine,
Yes.
Allen.
Yes,
Right.
yeah, and the biological, people like Stuart Kaufman and Brian Goodwin who have worked with a more biological tradition, but have kind of have come from this sort of this science base. That there's then another tradition, well, there are a number of other traditions, but that came out of the ideas of cybernetics and kind of thinking about feedback loops at a kind of more at a meso level. So in other words, these people will argue about these traditions, but there was more of a focus on the kind of like things like couple systems or feedback loops at a higher, more aggregated level, rather than
so not at the level of individual entities.
Yes, of the details. So that they were less focused on messiness and more focused on how do we understand these stable,
the structure.
Yes, these structures and stable patternings.
Give me some names. So who would be the originators of this thinking?
Now, unfortunately,
people like Ashby, I suppose.
Yes, but before Ashby, I'm trying to think of Gregory Bateson was involved in that, but there was somebody before him whose name I will have to look it up. I can't remember, that went back, a long way to von Bertalanffy would have written about him. It's gone out of my head.
Wiener, maybe.
Sorry,
Wiener.
Wiener was was one of them. So out of some of that, and also out of some of the physics tradition, there became a real emphasis on modelling. And I was telling you about, when I first came across complexity, it was watching these fractals, being plotted out, and there was a real excitement, and this went along with a computational capacity to actually model these things that didn't exist before the late 1980s, early 1990s. When I did my PhD, which is a computational PhD, I had to use, an enormous, at the time, computer, which probably had less computing power than my phone does now.
Definitely.
And it was like a big deal. I had to do it overnight, and and because I was using a computer other people were using, I had to go in at 10 at night and then go back at 6 in the morning. It was all this kind of thing. So it was a big deal. And the issue with computation, so computational modelling allowed you to address problems that couldn't be addressed analytically. So algebra and calculus wasn't enough. You could home in on things. So the classic chaos problem was the three-body problem, which Poincaré described in the late 19th century, where you can't analytically calculate what will happen when three bodies collide. Which seems like amazing, isn't it? 2 billiard balls, fine. 3 billiard balls, you can't analytically. You have to kind of home in on what might happen. That was the first kind of start of thinking about chaos. So the issue with modelling, and I've done modelling. This is not an anti-modelling rant. Is that you have to make simplifying assumptions to develop your models, and there are a whole range of simplifying assumptions that underpin different traditions in modelling, and it's not always expressed very clearly what those are. So, for example, sometimes you assume that only the most probable things can happen, not all possible things can happen. Sometimes you assume stationarity. You assume that things will you make the assumption that you will look at how things become stable. You don't ask the question of will they become stable. You sometimes don't allow diversity of elements. You clump things together and say they're all the same and they can't change. And you have to do this in order to model things, because otherwise it becomes completely intractable to model every variation in everything and allow that to change over time. But it does mean, that the map is not the territory, and you have to be careful about models can be very useful in finding something out about a particular complex situation. So Peter Allen used to say modeling is a form of thinking, and it will allow you to see patterns and structures that you wouldn't be able to see just by talking about it or thinking about it. So it has its value, but it's constrained by what you put into the model. So, for example, it's very difficult to model emergent phenomena because you can't put in things that
are not there.
Yes, or you can try. Some of what Peter tried to do was to experiment with things that might invade the system and see what happened. So you can do it to a degree. When you start to work with all possible things that could happen rather than the most probable, you're dealing with different things. Now, the simplest of all the models is deterministic chaos. It has the fewest. It's kind of limited in its variables. You can't include diversity, and it is a deterministic equation.
So why is it called deterministic chaos? Why chaos?
Because with these particular sorts of equations, it's deterministic in the sense that if you know the initial conditions, and remember we're modelling something, then everything else will follow from those initial conditions. So it's determined by those initial conditions. And some of the ways the equation behaves is it will look, kind of it will follow its path and kind of, look normal, and then there will be points at which it will turn into this kind of chaotic behavior. But the weird thing about deterministic chaos is that although it looks chaotic, so if you were listening to chaotic music, you wouldn't hear any structure in it. It would sound chaotic. But if you looked at to use the analogy, if you looked at the frequency spectrum, remember the days when we had, frequency analyzers on our mixers and things, you would see that it had quite stable. The frequency spectrum didn't vary very much. It was quite stable. So it is chaotic in one way, but it's not in another way. So it has, some of these equations have other attributes, like fractal behavior and self-similarity, which is slightly different. But
so chaos theory and fractals, those terms would belong to the kind of modeling tradition.
Yes, and to a particular end, the simplest end of the modelling tradition. And of course, when people discovered that, it was terribly exciting. And, there are certain cauliflowers that have fractals, where the patterning of the big bit is repeated in the smaller bits and the smaller bits.
I suppose there are examples like this in nature, like leaves or snowflakes we talked about.
Yes, and people have looked at, the coastline, how particular sorts of coastline have, that as you home in on it being smaller and smaller, it has similar characteristics. It's self-similar at different scales is what it means. But the fact that the maths of deterministic chaos is interesting doesn't mean that the attributes of a piece of maths that fits into the deterministic chaos end of the modelling tradition has lessons that apply to the whole world. So for example, sensitivity to initial conditions. Well, if it's a deterministic system, it means that sometimes, depending on the initial conditions, it will become chaotic and sometimes it won't. And so we then talk about the edge of chaos, and there's all sorts of things that come out of that. But not all systems are sensitive to initial conditions. So von Bertalanffy, for example, in biological systems talks about equifinality, where sometimes wherever you start, you end up in the same place. And it's, to give a kind of mathematical understanding of that, if you're deep within an attractor basin in state space, which you may or may not want me to unpick, but that things will end up in the same place whatever you do. If you're on the edge of attractor basins, between attractor basins, or on the edge of chaotic regions in state space, then it could be very sensitive. But in the real world, what does initial mean? So where I take that in my language is things can be sensitive to context. But there might be something that happens there that's really important, but there might be something that happens later on that's really important. And then other times, as we know, I can look at the story of my own life. Sometimes things seem to change very radically. For, you know, I make a decision that didn't seem to be anything to do with everything, but it changed a lot of things materially. Other times I make a change and nothing happens, you know. That's kind of, so what I'm concerned about is that people will mix. They'll take a bit of, you know, they'll take a bit of sensitivity to initial conditions, and then they'll go to power laws, and they'll take a bit of, you know, self-similarity from that, you know, and then they'll go somewhere else and they'll talk about non-linear.
Yeah.
Yes. And then say these are the attributes of a complex system. Now, that's become quite a popular thing to do, and it's very sexy because you can talk about strange attractors and fractals, and it sounds like we've got something sexy and interesting here. But they're meaningless out of context, and whether they apply to the complex, emerging, open social and environmental world is whether they're helpful. You know, I remember, you know, kind of in a sense rolling my eyes in horror at reading a paper called Fractal Leadership, which was saying, you know, well, because this is complexity theory. Complexity theory says leadership is self-similar. It's the same at every level. Now, you know, pragmatically, that's not true. You know, what a chief executive has to do in terms of thinking about the wider context, you know, managing this huge organization, dealing with shareholders is not the same as managing a team on the shop floor. It just isn't. It's silly, you know, it is misleading to say that's complexity theory. So people like carrying around a box of concepts that they can wheel out and
without understanding the tradition and the ontological assumptions behind these traditions.
And the fact that different sorts of mathematical models, you know, something that's an attribute of a model doesn't necessarily make it an attribute of the real world.
Yes.
So we can learn from that, you know, and we can ask questions. But, you know, so to go on to a different tradition, another tradition in complexity thinking is to do with a much more empirical view of it. So it is like, well, we know that the world is complex. What do we learn about it through being in it, through critically observing, through critically engaging? So
give me some names.
Well, the people like Ralph Stacey, you know, very much ended up here with his work on
University of Hertfordshire.
Yes, in complex responsive processes. So he moved from a much more kind of realist, almost positivist view. He was you know, an engineer. Originally, and his earlier writing was much more about complex adaptive systems, which is something else that we could talk about. But he moved into this real interest in how do we really experience this reflexive relational interaction, and what can we learn about the way to kind of change things, you know. So
by actively engaging in it.
So he went particularly right down into the micro in a sense, you know, that the devil was in the detail, and what could we learn from that. But action, you know, some traditions in action research, and I did a degree about 10 years ago, which was looking at the kind of interplay between complexity and action research traditions, has a more generic idea that you know, you have to, and it comes out in pragmatism in philosophy as well, is how can we develop a metaphysics, how can we develop our worldview through being in the world, through observing, through experiencing, through experimenting. So it's a different tradition in complexity that for me, what I like is this kind of dialogue between these kind of more abstract theoretical ideas and this test of, so what does that mean in the real world? What do I see that in the real world? How does the real world reflect back onto my theoretical stance? You know, how do I refine that? You know, am I really seeing that? So that's that kind of dialogic, you know, kind of interaction between some of these ideas. And
that's kind of what they say in action research is, if you want to know something about something, go try and change it.
Yes. Yeah. And have this, and you know, somebody like Brian Goodwin, who I've spoken about, who was involved with the Santa Fe Institute, was a biologist by background, but he became really interested in how we observe wholes, which in a way is another word for patterns. So if I want to really understand, you know, what the pattern is like, because it's not an objective thing out there, even my observation of it, my engagement with it will change it to a degree, and I'm bringing my own lens to it. But how do I start to say, what the culture is here, or what the quality of this town is, or how is this situation working here? How do I use in some sense a kind of critical subjective view? How do I take many voices in? How do I use still quantitative and qualitative data, but kind of sense into that holistically? So that's,
that also sounds like the empirical kind of way
yes,
of
it is.
understanding
Yeah,
complexity.
that fits into that. And I guess then another tradition, and these overlap, and I think of Paul Cilliers in particular when I say this, is there's a sort of philosophical tradition. And I think that philosophical tradition goes back before people use the word complexity. So I'm kind of entranced sometimes by reading. Somebody introduced me fairly recently to Mary Parker Follett, who was kind of involved with pragmatism, and her descriptions, her kind of empirical descriptions, in a way that imbued her philosophical stance, were capturing complexity, the complex world, without having to go through this kind of any of these physics traditions.
The superstructure of big theories.
Yes, or modelling or anything. She was just through that kind of process. So there was a kind of, Paul Cilliers was another one he was well known for a book called Complexity and Postmodernism. But he and a lot of other people, that Deleuze and all sorts of people, but people earlier than that too, who were thinking about complexity from a philosophical position, and then these different fields engaged. So we had back in the day some really engaging interactions with the likes of Ralph Stacey and Paul Cilliers, coming at the same topic, but from these different traditions.
So what would be an example of kind of an insight about complexity from the philosophical school? What sort of things would they say?
Well, one of the things that Paul Cilliers really brought to the fore, I think more than anybody, was the fact that in an uncertain, evolving, emergent world, where the path is made through walking, to use a different thing. So in a sense, there's this focus on, we're co-creating the future. We might backtrack to sort of Daoism and things at a later stage, but that we are co-creating the future through our actions and choices and inactions and so on. So the emerging future is dependent on the path that's been taken. It's shaped but not determined by. And the point he made, that because it's not a machine, because it's not objective, there is a sense in which things have an ethical component to them, whether you like it or not.
Because of the choice.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So his real philosophical emphasis was, and he worked in apartheid South Africa, so his context was interesting. Interestingly, Ralph Stacey was also originally from South Africa, which I find is just interesting. But Paul Cilliers, wrote about this. He was very engaged in his world, which was, pre-apartheid. It was during apartheid that he was developing this. And if this idea that if we don't see, if we don't engage with, in our own terms, the ethical nature of the steps we take or the things we ignore, then that has a real impact on what structures, what patterns emerge. There's
I can see that.
Yeah, there's been some quite interesting work, or interesting to me, in the political sphere, of how democracies get undermined, often by people turning a blind eye, of people going along with, or feeling impotent, well, that's a bit of a lie. We don't really like that. You know, that wasn't really true. That wasn't really the right way to behave as a politician. But, you know, hey ho, you know, we'll let it pass because we might lose our power, or, you know, we have other reasons for doing that. And the point of this idea of the ethical nature of each step is that over time, you know, if you get used to use that example of, you know, politicians, it's okay not to tell the truth, you know, hey, they're politicians, you know, what do you expect? It becomes instituted. And so and then it's much harder to change.
Yeah, I can see how this corresponds to the attributes that you mentioned.
Yes.
Yeah. So let me throw a couple of more terms at you. These terms that I think that I hear thrown about when people talk about complexity, but I don't quite know where to place them.
Yes.
So complex adaptive systems, where does that come in?
Well, it you know, on one level, it's kind of saying what I said at the beginning. You know, this idea of the conditions for complexity are kind of, you know, elements engaging reflexively. It implies that to me, it has a sort of teleological feel about things adapt. So things may be complex, but they may collapse. It's sort of it holds this idea that complex systems. So, well, I'll come back to the word system, you know, necessarily adapt. It sort of suggests adaptation. Well, they don't, you know, they're just complex. And, you know, sometimes the conditions might be such that things do adapt. But, you know, if things get too locked in, or if things are too chaotic, they might just...
So it's almost like privileging desired view of... Or a partial desired view of the dynamics of complexity.
Yes. So I you know, it doesn't, you know, it worries me, you know, that there's a kind of implication that things will adapt if they're complex. So the other thing is the word system, you know, which we've already talked about, that is a kind of reification of a thing, you know, that means like it's something we can design or intervene in or
even manage,
you know, and the thing is, as I was saying, I think is more fundamental, is how you deal with complex situations, you know, and you know, there may be some patternings, as I've said, that will be systemic. You know, I do use the word systemic. You know, this kind of interweaving of things is a systemic issue. We don't separate out different attributes and characteristics. We see things systemically and synergistically, but it reifies something into a thing that you can work with. So people talk about, I remember, you know, challenging somebody who was talking about coupling systems. So they were using it in the context of the school, and they were saying, well, you've got the parent system and you've got the children's system, and, you know, and you've got the governance system, and you've got, you know, the school system, you know, teachers, and that these systems couple.
Oh yeah.
And my point was, and in fact Mary Parker Follett, interesting, I've just, you know, in some of the writing I'm doing at the moment, I've just quoted her at length, because she was saying it isn't like that. You know, it's like that kid with that parent goes to that school and talks to that teacher, and actually what the systemic patternings might turn out to be are not those, you know, kind of reified ideas of these being separate systems. That's just a definition. It might be that there's certain groups of parents who are very close to certain teachers and certain pupils who create a kind of, you know, real power base, a real strong patterning that has a lot of impact in the school. And you know, that will be about individuals coupling together to reinforce patterns. So I need to go to a school and say, what are the dominant patternings here? Not say, how are these systems coupled?
Yeah, I see what you mean. So it's again going back into the real situation, as opposed to trying to deal with abstract entities such as these 5 systems that may be interlocking in a particular way.
Yes. So it's an idealization. Again, it's a reification. And it stops you seeing what's actually there, and which is more likely to be around the particularities of the context and something that's emerged over time. You'll have power players in a school that will come from odd places, like the dinner lady. In my day, the dinner lady had huge power in the school, had been there longer than half the teachers, knew how to deal with the pupils, that kind of thing. So
Okay.
so I feel uncomfortable with and a lot of people talk about complexity and complexity of adaptive systems as if they're the same thing, and to my mind, they're not.
That's really helpful. Okay, a couple of other terms. So simple rules or cellular automata.
Yes, right. Well, simple rules is a really interesting one, and I remember Jeffrey Hodgson writing something about this. So you can show with simple rules. So the classic one is the Boyd's, the murmuration. So we have murmurations. I love murmurations of starlings. I saw one in the States that was brown pelicans, which was awesome.
Wow.
So we have murmurations, and we can simulate murmurations through three simple rules, which is to do with follow the leader, maintain equidistance between your two neighbours, and I can't remember what the other one is now, but we can simulate a murmuration with simple rules. Great. It doesn't necessarily mean that that we can then it's good to have simple rules that if we then have simple rules in the real world, we will get what we want. It doesn't necessarily follow.
You can kind of see the appeal of this, right?
Yeah.
So it's almost like, well, we don't need to deal with all of the complexity.
Yeah.
If we just figure out what those
simple
3,
rules.
5, or 7 simple
Yes.
rules are,
Yes.
we get all of the complexity and beauty of things. And I think
Yes.
it's a similar argument with cellular automata, right?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I'll come back to cellular automata, but also the simple rules that we're dealing with the birds are micro simple rules. Now, what can be helpful, I would say, going back to saying about how do you get some commonality of standards in hospitals, is you have certain principles which are kind of at a higher level, or intentions, to, that which is a slightly different thing. But you kind of set, these hospitals are here for this purpose. We have certain principles of how people are treated, and what we're trying to achieve, but you leave the how to do it with more autonomy, that you can learn through shared learning. You can kind of emerge some good practices, but you don't define them. So there is something about simple principles that I would agree with. And the one issue that I think is really important to recognise about simple rules is you can describe the way birds behave with simple rules, but all they can do is do a murmuration, or go around buildings. They can't evolve into something else. So how do you have a simple rule that says as the environment changes, how do we have a simple rule which is about evolving new simple rules? So it doesn't really deal with emergence or changing context.
Or novelty, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
or this organisation's been run this way, but now it's got to do this because the world's changed. So I feel uncomfortable with simple rules. I think principles, rather than overly doing the detail of how to operate. But I struggle to see, it gets kind of, strategy is simple rules.
Yes, exactly.
Gets
That's
kind
what
of
I'm thinking.
overplayed.
Yeah.
There's something about cellular automata. So Chris Langton did this work with cellular automata back in the 1980s, and was able to show this phase change into which was called the edge of chaos, where you could show that things went from a kind of predictable normal behaviour into this chaotic behaviour. And there then became a whole tradition that came out of there about the edge of chaos being a fruitful place to be. And there was quite an interesting paper written some years ago where people tried to kind of say, how do we put this organisation on the edge of chaos, and what organisations seem to be on the edge of chaos, and is that good? And what that showed was that sometimes the chaotic, the edge of chaos feeling was about managers changing their mind a lot, or changing the rules a lot, and it created quite a lot of anxiety and uncertainty for people unnecessarily. And what I think is useful from the idea, but in one sense is that what I would say, we would say, is you don't want to be too structured or too chaotic. There's something about managing things in this middle ground, which is about give people enough structure and enough leadership, but enough autonomy to actually respond to changing circumstances and context. So there's not too tight, not too loose. I would certainly agree with, but mathematically, that was a very simple mathematical model that had a phase shift between two things. But in the state space of most complex systems, you can have things moving between attractor basins. They don't move into chaos. You can have things partially moving into two different attractor basins. It isn't like there's this edge really, but it becomes a thing, that people want to talk about, and becomes a reification, which they then associate with complexity. Whereas I would rather have this broader perspective of it, which is what I'm trying to say with paradoxical, is there's something about the middle ground and moving around and testing around the middle ground, that's useful. We don't want to be too tight or too loose, but saying more than that is giving a kind of false specificity, I think.
I also think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that maybe the interest in things like cellular automata or simple rules is kind of harking back to this idea that perhaps really the world is described by a handful of really simple formulae or or principles, right? And that produces the apparent complexity. But actually, if we can peer through this, we can discover these simple rules. So we can discover the rules that create unpredictability in cellular automata.
Well, cellular automata are a very, very simple kind of model, that have very few degrees of freedom, and it's a kind of historically interesting. There are people in the complexity world who place their focus on managing complexity, on in a sense reducing complexity. So what they would say is, if we really can model complex situations, we've got more of a handle on them, and then we'll be better at managing things. Now, there is some usefulness in that, as Peter Allen would say, that if you play around with models, you can discover things that you wouldn't have discovered just by thinking about them, or even just by observing them. So there is a place of that. What seems to go wrong in a sense is that people feel they place too much onus on that's the answer, rather than that is an interesting perspective on the problem. And depending on the models, it can also be misleading. So you'll remember Peter had a particular example of a dynamical systems model, which was a model of Chesapeake Bay.
Yeah.
And everybody, this was when I first arrived at Cranfield, everybody was rolling their eyes about, he talks about Chesapeake Bay. But it's a very, very good example of this. So there was a lot of data which allowed you to build a complex model of who ate whom and what the population densities were and how big things were. You had a lot of data.
Yeah, we're talking about fish, right?
Yeah, we're talking about fish, and plankton, and all that sort of thing. When you ran the model with these kind of these averages, so you dealt with averages, and then you had all these kind of parameters and interconnections. When you ran it, it collapsed. In other words, you ended up with everything dying in the model, which of course didn't happen in practice. And Peter's question was always, well, why doesn't that really happen? And the answer was, well, when things change, in this kind of, a complex, open, reflexive system, you might, for example, have, a bit of an illness in a particular fish. So the other fish who ate them have to adapt and eat other fishes. Or if fish start to die, it'll be the old or the young that die. So you get a different average size, that normally moves, or something comes in from the outside world. So what makes the system resilient, which you wouldn't get from a dynamical systems model of it, because it doesn't have the ability to deal with this, is how the variation creates the diversity, which changes the averaging, which changes both the behavior of the fish, but also the population densities and who eats whom and how big they are. All that is kind of flexing all the time. You wouldn't see that from a model. So, a model can be good at capturing what the current patterns are, but you have to be careful at assuming that you can then predict the future. It can predict some things, and it's useful to imagine that, but it's not going to give you the whole picture. And this issue of the devil is in the detail, the importance of that flexing through variation, that resilience through diversity, is very hard to model in any particular way.
And just for the sake of clarity, when we say modeling, you mean simulation modeling, so modeling something and then running it over thousands of iterations in a simulation model.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So it has its place, but I think it both gets overplayed as we've now got the answer. I mean, if you don't believe, you look at the economic models,
Sure.
and the complex models are used to model climate change, and they are very interesting and very useful, and we wouldn't know some of the things we know were it not for those complex models. But what they're having to do all the time is as we learn more, is put in different loops, so as the ice melted, and the permafrost melted, then there was huge clouds of, well, not clouds of, but outpourings of methane that had to be added into the model. It's much harder sometimes to model the particularities of how the jet stream changes, because the jet stream used to be pinned by the cold of the Arctic, compared to the warmth of the equator, because that's melting, and heating up so fast. Then the jet stream moves around in a different way. It's why we seem to get loads of rain forever, or no rain at all. There's a different dynamic to do with that. That's harder to model. There are different levels of modelling that are increasingly hard to get specificity. And the one thing that's incredibly difficult to model, which is absolutely fundamental, is how human behaviour will change and political behaviour will change, which is fundamental to the future of the climate. So the complexity of modelling of the climate is hugely important, and even with differing models and differing assumptions, it's created a lot of information and knowledge for us, but there are still some unknowns in it. And one of the, I was reading something recently about this, is that mostly, even with these complex models, they're still dealing with the most probable things that can happen. But if something happens here that's possible but not probable, it can create a whole cascade of things getting worse than you could possibly imagine, or in some cases not as bad as you can possibly imagine, and the envelope of possibles is even more significant. Things could be even worse than these models that deal with probabilities rather than possibilities can do. So
okay, so maybe last couple of terms, and then we'll move on. And these are the terms you mentioned, so the state space and the attractor basin.
Yeah.
What are these things, and sort of what do they bridge different traditions, or do they belong to certain traditions?
So state space is a kind of mathematical representation of information that is not just about complexity at all. So the simple one is, if you've got a piece of music, you can represent that music with notes, in your, music. Or if you look at the frequency spectrum of it and look at your spectrum analyzer, it has exactly the same information. There's a one-to-one correspondence between the frequency analysis and the listening to the notes. One is in the frequency domain and one is in the time domain. And the frequency domain is an example of a state space, where you have the dimensions of the state space of the separate frequencies, and they're independent. So that's what state space is. So when you talk about an attractor basin in state space, this is something in state space, and it's really saying that the combined characteristics of the situation remain relatively stable. So one of the examples I wrote about in Embracing Complexity is if you look at you know, the tradition of racing cars, the dimensions of a car might be its engine, its aerodynamics, its styling, which is kind of coupled to aerodynamics, its color, you know, its kind of vibe, you know. So if we said, you know, I've just bought a Maserati, you know, it might be red, you know, it might be racing green, you know, it might be black, you know, it's probably not going to be pale blue, you know, or let's say, you know, so in the state space of all the possible attributes that you could have for a car. So if you define the dimensions of state space as styling, performance, color, efficiency, you know, or cost effectiveness, let's say, you wouldn't find that there'd be everything there.
That they're distributed evenly.
Yes,
yeah.
You'd find clusters where you know, something that's high performance is probably not going to be very efficient, and you know, might have certain colors and certain sorts of styling. So that would be an attractor basin, and or a niche, if you want to use that word which you'd use in marketing. So if you then want to enter the car market, you could try and develop a new niche, but you might say, well, there's a kind of saloon car niche, you know, which has got certain sorts of size, styling, efficiency, and there might be a, you know, a funky, you know, pale lemon, you know, mini, you know, there's a sort of funky something or other niche,
for a particular group of people. Yeah.
So where am I going to home in? Am I going to kind of join these niches, or am I going to be really brave and say I'm going to have a really, really, you know, amazingly super electric car, you know, that outperforms everything, and I'm in a sense creating a new niche. So that's a kind of way of thinking about attractor basins. Now, as Peter used to point out to me, in the complex world with kind of non-linear and this reflexive interactions, it is slightly misleading to think about state space, because the dimensions aren't independent of each other.
Okay.
So to use it, you know, so the styling of a car and its aerodynamics are kind of, they're not separate. They're not independent. So we've got to be slightly careful when we talk about attractor basins in the real world, because they're not as kind of clear cut as that. But that's what you're trying to describe. It's not something that happens in the real world. It's in this kind of
representation of the real world.
Yes, which is still helpful, you know. So to think about niches, you know, in markets is obviously helpful. And the other thing to say about it is, if you get something emerging, then the state space may change. So what were niches, some of them may disappear and new ones might appear. So it's a bit like, you know, if state space was, you know, if there's an earthquake in state space, it will change the existing niches, not just create a new niche. So.
And presumably they're called attractor basins because events tend to fall into them.
Yes, right? Yes, or not exactly events.
Not exactly events, yeah,
but behaviours.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So what's a strange attractor?
Well, it's a particular characteristic of a chaotic, deterministic, chaotic system which behaves in a rather strange way, where you get this kind of chaotic behaviour, but it all remains in kind of one place.
Okay. Jin. So we talked about the nature of complexity and the kind of the attributes of it, and sort of the different schools of thinking about complexity. But I suppose just like with any major idea, you can't have a single person or even a single group of people kind of coming up with it, and there must be connections to the way we've thought about this before, or maybe in different places. Is that the case? What does this worldview resonate with?
Well, that for me has been a kind of lovely, you know, exciting exploration over, you know, quite a long time, and It was started in a way. I like to tell this story of Peter Allen coming back from a meeting in London, and he walked into the office in Cranfield when I was working here, clutching a copy of the Tao Te Ching, and it was a particular copy by Ames and Hall, I think 2003. And he very excitedly said, "I've been reading this on the train," and he said the introduction, you know, where Ames and Hall described the cosmology, the worldview of Daoism, said it just reads like a complexity theory textbook. And I got really interested in this. I was kind of interested from quite a young age in other philosophical traditions anyway, like Buddhism and Daoism. So I found it really exciting to kind of explore this view of the world as taken from Daoism, and the kind of the backstory that people have written about is that during the so-called Axial Age, which was the end of the late Bronze Age, a lot of hierarchical power structures in different parts of the world were breaking down. So there was a more kind of chaotic social structure situation, and it was causing people to reflect quite deeply on kind of what is the nature of things. And this was a time of change, you know, and so what I found was that in China, in India, but also in the Middle East with the pre-Socratic philosophers like Heraclitus, there was this emphasis on flow and change. So there was a presupposition of change over stability, as opposed to the Platonic ideal, which we've largely followed, which is a preference of stability over change. You know, things are stable and occasionally they change. Things are universal and occasionally they're not, as being the kind of Western focus.
Whereas, kind of privileging order and structure and stability.
Yes, and kind of truth and these kind of transcendental ideas. Whereas the Taoist idea was about flow, but it was also about what Ames and Hall call this kind of acosmotic view. So so the cosmology is that they de-emphasize universality. They're saying the most important things are about what happens locally and contextually and historically, which of course is very much what Darwin was saying, and where complexity has picked up. So and it has other things like episodic change. You know, the door isn't always open, and when the door opens, you know, outpours this creative spontaneity emerging. You know, there's all sorts of things in it, and you think, wow, it's the same. You know, there's an ontological resonance, to put it that way, a resonance in this kind of understanding of the way the world works, that is explored beautifully. Paradox, you know, the end is always in the beginning and the beginning is in the end. You know, there's all sorts of aspects to it that I found entrancing, both in terms of reading it, but also reading the commentary, particularly Ames and Hall, who wrote several books on this kind of Chinese perspective. So I found it really, really interesting. And for me, it's like, well, golly, you know, if people concluded the same things, so we've done all this, you know, sophisticated physics, biology, mathematical modeling, you know, simulations, and we kind of arrive at the same place as they did in the 5th century BC, you know, and Buddhism has you know, similarities as well. Isn't that amazing? You know, there's something, this kind of resonance creates a kind of sense in me that, you know, this is really important, that there's something here that is just not like a bit of an idea, you know, an alternative worldview, but something that has a sort of depth and integrity to it that's worth considering, on the basis that if we embrace the idea of the complexity worldview, the idea of the world as complex, we might do a better job of flowing with it, of being successful, of looking to the future. And, you know, there's a lot in Daoism about how to behave, you know, how to, in a sense, understand that you both are moving with the flow, the Tao, but you're co-creating the Tao. So that the path is made through walking. So there's a kind of...
So you're not a neutral observer out looking at the system outside.
No, or a victim of flow. It isn't
yeah.
like, well, here's the flow, I better attune myself to it. But it's both understanding that you attune yourself to it, and yet you're also participating in it. You're part of it as well as attuning to it. And so it's a bit like, if you're facilitating a meeting in an organisation, you're wanting to tune in, so I'm a facilitator. I walk into a board meeting, I'm going to have to, hopefully I've done my homework and I've met people beforehand, so I have some idea of what's going on. But if I've just walked in, there's a kind of attunement, what is in a sense the flow, what's moving here, how do I kind of move with that flow, and yet, where are there opportunities to kind of create some difference, or amplify something that's going on, or support something, that's that kind of both and is very much part of Daoism. So,
do you know, it's making me think of Tolstoy. I'm a big fan of Tolstoy's philosophy and his writing, and one of the reasons I like War and Peace is because I think it shows you quite graphically and in a lot of detail how individual lives are intertwined with massive kind of geopolitical events, and almost like what you're saying, you can't not align yourself with the big geopolitical events like the war, for example, in his novel, because it kind of forces you to be there. But at the same time, you don't fully surrender your will, and you still look for ways to move where you want to move, and you both align yourself with the natural flow of historical events, but you're also pursuing your life goals as well.
Yes, or even if it's not your own life goals, you're working out how to engage with what, so it is this idea of path dependency, that we do, to some degree, we haven't necessarily shaped the past, we arrive here. But we have agency about not just like, what do I want, but how do I engage with the whole? How do I play my role in shifting things? And I'm very interested in some of the writing about how people shift what can seem inexorable norms. Of people have written a lot about populism and the rise of dictatorship in a variety of ways, and how we can see ourselves as victims of that.
Yeah, because you could see yourself as quite powerless in the face of these massive tides of massive patterns, big patterns.
And the paradox is, in a way, that sometimes shifts happen by individuals, acting with more authenticity or more resistance, here, there, and everywhere, and things can change. That often there's an example with Havel writing about the power of the powerless, that was in Czechoslovakia, wasn't it? About how people in all sorts of places, in feeling quite isolated, started to resist or started to be more authentic, and somehow that was part of how things kind of shift into something new. So I think that complexity theory also has this kind of this idea that as we're co-creating the future, that there's something for me about feeling I have an agency in that, even if it's not kind of obvious, and understanding I'm co-creating the future individually and collectively. It's not just about harnessing it, but this idea, which is a Taoist cosmology, is there isn't a there out there, that we're always kind of in it, and the flow that they talk about is both something we're inside, and we're party to, and we're creating. So Taoism, and the other thing I've come to really like about Daoism is that when you read it and immerse yourself in it, and some of the commentaries on it, I do think it has it offers advice in a sense. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is that they really emphasize this idea of noticing, fissures or growing shoots, being attuned, that the wise leader is attuned to things at the beginning of the beginning. In fact, I remember you telling me, what was that book called?
The Treatise on Efficacy.
Yes.
Yeah. He talks about that. So that's Francois Julian.
Yes.
He talks about cleavages, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's something about the beginning of the beginning. If you attune yourself to the merest hints at something changing, you can, in a sense, follow that or protect it or enhance it, such that when you come to act, you act at the end of the beginning, in a sense, when things, you choose your time. And so it kind of emphasizes that our knowing, this kind of stuff that I was talking about sometimes with understanding wholes, investigating patterns. It's the same in terms of how do we get this sense that there's a crack here, and the good facilitator in a meeting will sometimes think, there's an opening. There's something I can, and could you just say that again? Or I'm just noticing, you two are, feeling a bit uncomfortable about that. How do you attune? And it's not just, it has a place, obviously, it's using the cognitive as well, but it's actually forming a place for the complex system that we are, which is about our visceral sense of things and our imagination, our intuition, and kind of allowing that a place to say, there's an opportunity, now's the time.
And what strikes me about what you've just said is that obviously you can't pre-plan this, right? So you can't know when it's going to happen.
No.
So you just have to be kind of ready and open to this. And second, again, to come back to your earlier point, you have to be there sort of on the ground, kind of the coal face interaction with this. You can't be managing it, from your office on the 12th floor.
No. I remember having a conversation with somebody in international development. We were talking about drought in northeast Africa, and he said, and I quote, he said, "I don't have to go and look at it. I know about drought. I've done drought in South America," and it's that
Yes, exactly.
that if you go on the ground, and build trusted relationships and start to attune through those, both hard data and soft data about what's really going on here, you're much more able to call the drought early than wait until the quantitative measurable things are, the cattle are all dead, before you intervene. So it's that attunement that requires being on the ground and knowing that's what you've got to do, talking to people, making friends, knowing, building trusted relationships. So somebody who you've known a while goes, do you know what, this is different this year. You're more comfortable, to kind of act, so to speak. So that was Daoism, and I still go back to finding new layers in it. I'm really interested in Ames and Hall in particular, because they, for example, make the point, which I thought was completely fascinating, was that the original translation between Chinese and English was done by missionaries who have a particular worldview.
Yes.
So they
an agenda, maybe.
They co-opted words in Chinese to mean certain things like heaven, or so they kind of used the words to fit with what they were trying to say, because they were obviously trying to go back to the Chinese and say, well, this is, I want to tell you about our Christian heaven, and now I've got the word to use for that, because I've translated what you said in my terms. And what Ames and Hall were saying is, if you use Chinese dictionaries to translate their own words, you get the nuance of some of these words, and they didn't tend to be what they call transcendental ideas, that there was much more emphasis on what happens locally and contextually, rather than the idea that there's a heaven or there's a flow and it's a thing. So you have to be quite careful at looking at some of the translations of things like the Tao Te Ching or the commentaries, because they kind of, it's almost like they presuppose transcendental language and transcendental ideas, that is universal ideas of truth or commonality, which aren't really embedded in the Tao Te
spirit
Ching.
of Tao Te Ching.
And it changes how you read it and what you take from it as a practice. So I think it's very interesting. So I would say Daoism in particular has this processual worldview that we've been talking about is embedded in complexity, as one of Prigogine's earlier books was called From Being to Becoming. In other words, we have to understand that stability is a temporary state in a processual world, which is what the Taoists say, and Buddhism, which is certainly the work of the early Buddhist. I mean, Buddhism covers an awful lot of cosmologies and ontologies, yes. But the early Buddhist ideas, which was worked on particularly by a woman called Joanna Macy, who's an amazing woman in her 90s now, whose PhD was on Buddhism and systems thinking back in the day. And it's
what sort of year are we talking about? 80s or 70s?
90s, I think.
90s,
that
okay.
was, but she did it as a mature student. But one of the ideas that comes in this earlier interpretation of Buddhism is the idea of emptiness. And what the Buddhists mean by emptiness is not there's nothing, but that the things we regard as real and objectively there are on various timescales, always are co-created by their constituent relationships, which is what I was talking about with complexity. So it has this focus on self-regulating patterns. Mm-hmm. So that they're not different, and Buddhism has this idea of karma, which is both collectively and individually. In a sense, you reap what you sow, which is the same as saying the path is made through walking. So it has a similarity to Daoism in that, but it has more emphasis on how we have to understand that when we're engaging with things, whether it's patterns in our own thought or patterns in objectively in the ecology, that things are always temporary. They're not things. They are co-created, co-constituted patterns. So that's very interesting to me as well. And both of those traditions, have suggestions about how to act in the world. That is also interesting. So there's kind of those. I find that really fascinating. That those and Heraclitus as well. You never step in the same river twice, that sort of idea. So there's those really early traditions that have really interested me. But what I really enjoy doing is so I heard a talk a few weeks ago, indeed, on Mary Parker Follett, who was influenced by John Dewey in particular and William James, and is a kind of pragmatist. And Peter Allen always used to talk about that there was a sort of pragmatism in underpinning complexity, which is in the sense is what we're saying. You have to kind of be there and understand it's contextual and work with what is here and in the here and now. But some of the way she describes issues around policy and issues around, she has a lovely description, for example, about what we were talking about earlier about couple systems in schools, where she was talking about, it's not really like that. It's this little boy goes home to this parent who happens to know this teacher, and that's how change begins. And I read this and think, wow, that's exactly right. So, one of the things I'm doing and enjoy doing is kind of trying to show that people come at these ideas from completely different directions, but they have a lot to offer this kind of resonance with these ideas. We don't have to call it in a sense, this is complexity theory that comes from here and argue about that, but there's something at the core of it about, flow, about emergence, about the importance of variation, which is embedded, other people have noticed that.
Yeah, so it's almost like different people and different traditions and different cultures, I suppose, pick up on similar aspects of reality, so to speak.
Yes, through a kind of living in it way, more than this tradition has. And it's in the reason that the pre-Socratics, it's kind of pre-Platonic in a way, that Plato in a sense changed the game, which was about this idea of, there are ideals, which sit out their ideal forms, and this nasty chaos stuff is just, it's we're on the way to perfection, So these are kind of abstract theories that are not that are ideas that got kind of embedded. And I remember coming across Prigogine talking. It's a kind of YouTube conversation he was having with people, and I thought he put this beautifully, that when Newton discovered Newton's laws of motion, it was seen to Newton, who was very religious, that he was revealing the mind of God. And because God can see the past, present and the future and knows everything, then almost like by definition, if science is revealing the mind of God, it would have that transcendental, universal quality. So there's been an emphasis on Western science on those kind of qualities, which obviously exist in Newton's physics, which was only really ever supposed to apply to planets or billiard balls in a sense. It had a limited availability, but the Voltaire and the Marquise de Châtelet, Voltaire was the lover of the Marquise de Châtelet. She was the mathematician and translated Newton's Principia from Latin into French. And this was used as a kind of design ideal for the French Enlightenment, and this idea of kind of constructing perfect societies. So it had it became a science of everything, having not really started there. And I think there's been this emphasis on the West on kind of truth, universality, these laws, and there are obviously, laws of physics like electromagnetism that are deterministic and do have this quality. But when you put them all together in the real messy world, thermodynamics kind of messes things up partly, and quantum physics in a different way, for many anyway, messes things up. Then you focus much more on indeterminism and localization that kind of gets lost in the washing. It's a bit like the Leibniz said to Newton at the time: the structure of the universe is kind of hidden. You have no way of telling us why the Earth is here as opposed to there, and why the sun is our sun and we're in this bit of the galaxy. You've got nothing to say about that. And there's a bit in the queries to the optics, apparently, where somebody asks, a lot of different editions of the optics had these queries that questions would be asked, and then Newton would try and answer them in subsequent editions.
Right.
And one of them is, why is the solar system flat? And I have to admit to never finding this, but I have this on from a mathematical physicist who is a good friend of mine. Apparently the answer was because God periodically pats it back into place.
Okay.
So that there's the point I'm making is that in the West we've emphasized these universal laws, determinism, and kind of fudged the fact that in actuality we wouldn't have clusterings of planets, for example, if there was a kind of symmetry in say there was a Big Bang and it was symmetrical, you wouldn't get the clustering. So it's the messiness and the particularity of the places in the universe that kind of create what we see, and a kind of built-in baked-in indeterminism into things that is picked up more by these other traditions. And there are others too, the whole kind of process philosophy traditions that about. But I enjoy finding writing and things from completely different places and going, golly, that's a really good example of what we're trying to say here. And actually by connecting these, it gives much more depth and nuance to these ideas. Because
can you give me a couple of examples, or maybe an example of where these traditions or these readings have informed your work on complexity? But the reason I'm asking this is because it's very easy to succumb to the temptation to just say, oh, well, that's related and that's related. And isn't that interesting?
Yes.
But I'm assuming there's more than this. Yes,
it does give strength to the ontological, so I think
Okay, yeah,
we
go ahead, yeah.
we underestimate. So I've got another answer to this as well. But we underestimate the importance of our worldview in what we do. So, like we were saying earlier, if you kind of have this idea that there is a right answer, you know, that people who are economists and strategists can feel absolutely dreadful when the world didn't do what it was supposed to do. You know, they didn't predict the 2008 crash, you know, or their strategy didn't work, and they're kind of saying, but we did everything, you know, we had all the information, we analysed it in the most wonderful way, and it didn't work, and I feel bad, I've failed, you know, in my job. You know, that's very pernicious, and this idea, as we were saying before, is, you know, you do all this work and there's a strategy and a plan, and then you implement it, as opposed to this kind of iterative way about where you develop a strategy with the best information you have, and then you do some doing, but you use that information from the doing to feed back into, you know, rethinking the strategy. So it's a kind of much more reflexive process. So I think the issue about really saying this worldview is really worth embedding yourself in. You know, look, it's the Daoist thought like this. You know, the process philosophers think like this. You know, this activist things like this. You know, that gives it
almost like lending legitimacy to it. Yeah, yes, and weight. Yeah,
and it has a sort of you know, one of the things you know, we might talk about, you know, I'm trying to do in some of the work I'm doing at the moment is add much more kind of depth and nuance to some of these ideas, because you can kind of read self-organization and go, oh, well, I've got that then, you know, or, you know, and the people who go, you know, use some of the other terms and think they've got it,
yes,
but they're still sitting in a sense in a worldview which is, you know, well, it's more complicated than we thought, but if we can just get a handle on that through our modeling and interrogation, then we've got it again. You know, we can manage it and be successful because we know it. That's a different worldview than saying how we harness and embrace this richness of the patterning and understand things emerge that we haven't seen, but are nevertheless not random. You know, they're kind of shaped by, but not inexorably determined by the past. It's really important for the way we engage with each other, how we're successful, how organisations succeed, and, you know, indeed how we think about, you know, the long-term systemic issues of the future of our societies and the planet. You know, it kind of gives depth to thinking different questions. So it's almost like it gives you different questions, and that in itself is very powerful. I think beyond that, I've really, for example, out of Daoism, I've really enjoyed playing with and reading more about this idea of attuning to, but noticing how you seize opportunities or in a sense nurture growing shoots. You know, that sort of approach to change I find has been really interesting, you know, and I like the way that's written about, and it makes me think. And there's, you know, the art of war, you know, sadly it was about how to win a war, but, you know, there's an awful lot in that that's more generally applicable.
Yeah, just about kind of pursuing an intention in a complex world. Yeah.
Yes, and you know, people go back to some of Goethe's approach to knowing, you know, and the idea of, you know, that Brian Goodwin explored and other people about how do you engage with the idea of wholes, which I think you do as much as, you know, if I arrive at a meeting, how do I sense myself into here? You know, how do I have a sense of what this organisation is like? You know, what in all sorts of ways. You know, how do it legitimates, because we're talking about indeterminism and not a kind of, you know, objective machine out there that I'm interrogating. It legitimates, you know, more using what's called critical subjective ways of knowing, where I am still using, I can give examples of that, where you know, I would, well, to give you an example, I was doing some big policy work about a Middle Eastern country, and, you know, I was interested in trying to look towards the future. You know, so in a sense, you know, in looking towards the future, you're dealing with known unknowns, not unknown unknowns, but nevertheless, you know, you can get a long way with known unknowns. But there's things like population growth. Now, that's a kind of factual thing that I would include in my analysis. You know, if a country's got, you know, half the population are below 15, you know, that's quite significant. Or, you know, what are the key companies? Where is the wealth in this country? You know, what about drought? You know, what about natural resources? You know, that you're combining in your diagnostic, in your analysis, those, you know, there's certain things that you can know, coupled with, you know, this has had a history of ethnic violence for 200 years. You know, that's not gone away. You know, how is that
probably not
out?
going to go away.
No, you know, so how do you take that into account? So you would work as much as you can in a scenario planning way. You know, again, I'm not inventing a tool, you know, or foresighting. You're working with hard and soft data, and you're working systemically. So in other words, you know, even if I have a kind of core question I'm interested in, which is about the future of the economy, then I need to look at, you know, the social structures, the political structures, the environment, you know, and of course, you know, the rise of pandemics. You know, you know, if you're an economist now, you can't afford not to know about, you know, what might be emerging in that sense. You know, what was the biggest thing that's happened to the world economy? You know, it was,
absolutely.
Yeah, you know, so you work systemically, but you're working with quantitative and factual and hard information as much as is there, but you're also working with opinion. So I would be wanting to talk to a range of people, read a range of reports, you know, look at the kind of historical context as well as the future looking, and then start to, as you do with scenario planning, start to say, well, if this scenario was likely to happen, what would be the signs on the ground I should look for?
Right. Yeah, very, very observable, very local.
Yes.
Very specific, very concrete.
Yes. And also, you know, if like we're way off piste and some unknown is fast, you know, things don't necessarily happen fast. How am I going to notice? Where have I got my antenna? You know, people or processes. You know,
which I think, I suppose, goes back to the point you made earlier about, although committing to a course of actions, not neglecting the alternative courses that you've discounted.
Yes, sometimes by choosing to do this, you know, other things become, you know, it's a bit like, you know, if you choose this career, you can't easily go back to that career, sort of thing. But it's just keep tracking. If you're looking at scenarios, you know, you're saying, well, what is arising? So I do find that this kind of, you know, wandering around the social science, philosophical, scientific, and other literature, and sometimes hearing just something on the news or, you know, something that triggers my interest. I find that both helps me to articulate more what the complexity worldview is in more depth, with more depth and nuance, and look at its implications. So it's a for me it's very enjoyable process, and I think that's what this resonance, and perhaps I could say something about quantum gravity in this as well, because it's kind of so
if there is a resonance with that, absolutely.
I know. Well, so you know, to a degree, one's a physicist, always interested in physics, and there's a guy called Carlo Rovelli in particular who's written about quantum gravity, and it's you know, these are very, you know, they're not only difficult to understand, even, you know, I'm supposed to understand quantum physics. I have a PhD in it, but, you know, that was a long time ago, and it's you know, as I think Richard Feynman, physicist, said, you know, anybody who says they understand quantum physics is wrong, you know, because it is very complex. But when you look at what Carlo Rovelli in particular talks about, and he's talking about the interplay, the interdependence of places where the gravitational and the quantum are coming together in certain conditions, and he talks about relationality. You know, so
meaning what?
Well, it's what we started with, this kind of idea of reflective interweaving of relationships. This is another word for what we're talking about with complexity. It's a relational worldview. It's like we're emphasizing the interconnectivity of things, their interdependencies, their interweavings, and that, you know, there's there's a whole kind of approach to quantum mechanics called relational quantum mechanics, which is saying that the things that are, in a sense, concrete, or even that word is a tricky one to use in this context, but things are held in relationship. There isn't, that things don't really exist in the quantum world. They exist in relationship. So we talked about the role of the observer, but obviously, quantum physics isn't always designed for this little planet with these little people called humans on it. It is using the word in a much more broadest sense. But, if you like, the interplay between this quantum fluctuation and this gravitational fluctuation, what becomes real is the interplay between the two, not the things themselves. So he ends up talking about indeterminacy. He talks about the local and the contextual, and he talks about the relational. And, I find that really interesting. Here's a whole other world, view and
coming from a
maths.
completely different tradition, right? A completely different way of trying to understand the world. Yeah.
And here we are again, at these similar points, and that's absolutely fascinating. But I'm not wanting to overplay that. I get quite worried when people take analogies from quantum physics and then kind of apply it to the real world. It's useful metaphorically, but one has to be careful. But just the fact that they're describing, the universe wouldn't be the universe if it behaved like a machine, or if it was full of things interacting. The things kind of dissolve into kind of probability waves, and
so no Laplace's demon then.
No Laplace's demon. Sorry. I know you're
fair enough.
Yes, you're keen on him, but that's it.
Yeah, I think he would be a very very interesting creature.
Yes, he would. Yes, he would.
Kind of moving the universe with levers and buttons, and and a massive probably calculator, massive calculation apparatus. Yeah.
But of course, if he spoke to you, he'd be changing the future of the universe. So
there we go. Yeah.
Hey ho. So so it is. It is an interesting and fruitful approach to trying to delve down into some of these ideas. And,
I think it's an interesting, and I might be misinterpreting what you've said, but I think it's a really interesting point that the fact that you're discovering these connections with these massively different and very, very kind of disparate schools of thought. Kind of shows you that trying to formulate it kind of shows you that in order to really embrace complexity, to use your term, you have to make you really have to make a shift in the worldview. You have to really make a shift in the mindset, almost move into another tradition, right?
Yes.
And that's not an easy leap to make.
No,
I suppose, just to finish the thought, both rationally and emotionally as well.
Yes. No, I think there's, it creates a resistance, because it's kind of saying you don't know as much as you think. You don't know what's going to happen as much as you can't control things.
Yeah, where is my universal truth? I mean, come on.
Yes, and what do I do next, and how do I know it'll work? So there is a kind of emotional resistance to it. And a kind of, cognitive resistance as well. And it was Cliff Bowman, who we both know well, and who was the one of the authors of Embracing Complexity. So there's pointing down here at the book. He has said more than once, it's a bit like when you get infected with complexity thinking. You can't not think it. It changes everything. And a lot of what I've tried to do with people in organisations, in teaching, in master's degrees in various parts of the world and places, is to get people to even surface their worldviews, even to explore what they take as read, and then sort of, or and I do that in a variety of ways. So it might be a bit like, hands up who's been involved in strategy development. Keep your hand up if it's gone to plan. There's always two people. It's always somebody who says it did. But and then you say, well, why hasn't it gone to plan? Well, we learned things. The world changed around us. We misinterpreted this. So they then describe the complex world.
Yeah, but presumably the answer in many cases for them would be, well, we just didn't do enough analysis. But only if we had,
Yeah,
it would have gone to plan.
they don't actually, and I've asked that question of a lot of groups, and they don't. They do kind of know secretly that's a game you have to play, and people don't find it difficult to, you know, to kind of tell you why it didn't go to plan. Or sometimes I ask the question of, you know, think back to when you were 16. You know, has your life gone to plan? Think what you had intended for yourself at 16. And people look at me as if I'm mad and say, well, I didn't have a plan. You know, like, oh, well, that's interesting. You know, but the human is in the same world as the organisation. You know, but we're you know, and again, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying I have plans. You know, plans are good, but and intentions are good. You know, maybe that's sometimes, you know, you know, really home in on collectively on your intentions and allow the plans to be more short term and, you know, changeable, so to speak. But, you know, if you get people to describe why their life hasn't gone to plan, again, they come up with a description of the complexity worldview, really, about, you know, well, things change and we learned, and, you know, I made this decision, you know, I met my future husband on a train when I thought I'd go to this university and he was going to that university, so I changed my mind. You know, these kind of life-changing events that sometimes happen, you know, etc. So, you know, I think it's really important that people explore. So I'm not, you know, I try not to say this is a better worldview, but I am, you know, which I kind of think, you know, but the mechanical worldview has a lot to answer for in our world. And, you know, even, you know, all the companies that become very dominant, you know, you can impose a mechanical way of working if you're powerful enough in the world. So it's like,
of course, yeah.
It's like insurance companies. You know, when I had a car accident a few years ago, and I spent most of the next day when I'm in shock trying to fill in forms and answer questions, you know, and sometimes several times answering the same questions.
Yes.
And they've kind of exported the complexity to the consumer, and they sit there with their machine and their checklists and, you know, their call centres, you know, with scripts.
Yeah.
And the fact that none of it quite applies to me, and I wish somebody had just, you know, deal with it for me, you know, so that machine works until somebody comes along and says, well, you know, I don't think the consumer wants to do that, you know, let's work in this way, and something else happens. So you can make the world, if you've got enough power, do your bidding for a while.
Absolutely, yeah. As we've seen lots of examples of
yes,
this. Yeah.
And then things collapse because the world changes and sometimes changes quite rapidly and radically. So I think even in the terms, even if you want to say all I care about is the success of my organisation, you know, worrying about your context and changes, you know, and the future. And future-proofing that organisation, you know, and having ways of knowing when you have to adapt it makes sense, even if your espoused interest is in, you know, I just want to make profit and satisfy my shareholders, and you know, I think you know, there are other people that are now kind of educating, you know, master's students to say, well, that is, you know, that is the espoused core of what organisations, businesses are for, but they are probably the most powerful institution in the world now. These big global institutions are kind of largely, you know, can manage not to be regulated in that they can move between countries. They are not here to worry about the future of society and the planet. But, you know, if they're not careful, they will kill off their, you know, if inequality rises to a sufficient level and people can't afford their goods, it's not going to help much, you know. Or, you know, if we're all in such crisis, you know, through burgeoning climate change and geopolitical unrest,
the whole economy collapses.
yes,
then, yeah.
you know, it's not going to help them much.
Yeah.
So even in their own terms, that thinking more broadly and longer term and contextually is going to help to future-proof those organisations. And if they see their role not just in terms of you know, reputational risk, but genuinely, you know, questioning the kind of ethical position of our institutions, you know, what are they there for and what could they be there for, and wouldn't actually, you know, accessing those ideas about, you know, we could really play a role in minimising climate change, and it's going to be in our best interest as well as yours. You know, it is you know, is kind of an important part of it, I think.
Mm. And I suppose you've already started answering my next question, which is, well, how do we live in this complex world? I mean, we can accept the fact that we do live in it, and the world is like this, as you say, complex, whether you like it or not.
Yes.
So what are some of the implications or guidelines we could draw from the understanding of complexity, from the complexity theory perspective?
Yeah.
And what are some of the guidelines for action?
Well, I think one of them, which I have spoken about, is this idea of a wide-ranging diagnostic. Actually spending the time at whatever level you're doing it, whether you're looking at a region and thinking about whether a business should enter that, or you're talking about making an organization effective, but you spend the time looking at its history, and looking systemically and widely, that you don't, in a sense, set the boundaries. You follow your nose to a degree. You work with different perspectives. If I'm doing this at the organizational level, I would ask to have a steering group that had people on it from different departments and different levels in the organization, and even better, sometimes having customers and suppliers. So you get the person who will say the emperor has no clothes, and challenge. So you set up structures that facilitate that gathering of information in the broadest sense, and facilitate as much as you can the challenge. I've asked to speak to people who left the organisation. I've asked to speak to customers they've lost. I have this idea of how do I collect, not just me, how do I set up a steering group that works together to collect this kind of diagnostic, and then how do we work as a group to say, so what does that mean that we need to do?
So what are we diagnosing through this process?
What's there? What are the patterns of relationships? Where is there some, unraveling going on? Where are things very fixed? What is this organisation about, or what is its market about? So I'm kind of saying what's there and what's its depth. What are the deep structures? What are the unraveling parts of it? Where are there some opportunities? So the conversation would be about how do we describe things now, or how do we describe the market now, or the broader context, not just the market of people who buy our goods, but what's society doing? What are the important social change that's going on that might materially affect us? So we ask these big questions, and it's not for everybody. You have to, you get some experts in, to speak, but that's what you're trying to say, is what's the starting point. And then what this group would also do is, so where do we start then? So what are the next steps? So the focus might be on how do we develop our strategy, or how do we change things, or how do we become more resilient? It would have different inquiry questions, but we would use that broad picture to start homing in on, well, where do we start? And then, if I were, designing this, I would be building in contingency, regular reviews, and kind of attuning people early to the idea, well, it won't go to plan, whatever we do. So what are we going to do? How will we know when it's not going to plan, and what will we do about it? So you're kind of instituting processes that allow you. Sometimes, in fact, the best ways I've worked is I never use the word complexity.
Of course, yeah.
Because people get all hung up and start talking to me about strange things.
Exactly. And fractals.
Yeah, I'm trying to get people to say, well, things don't really go to plan, do they? Well, what's happened that we didn't expect on the environment recently? What are you worried about? Even with people like sessional workers, I've did this with a charity, and I asked them the question of what's new and interesting. What interested you or surprised you with the groups you were working with? And just that one question at the end of a really formal review of, have you achieved your targets? Yep. It opens up a diagnostic which says, well, actually, this group we're starting to talk about this, or I was really surprised at, and just asking those questions changes things.
So you're saying, and that diagnostic would be, or that diagnostic process would be performed also at the very kind of granular level. Because as you were talking, I was thinking, well, in kind of traditional approaches to strategic management, you would look outside. So you would look
Yes.
at the massive trends using
Yes.
the basic pestel analysis, for
Yes.
example, or something like this.
Yes.
But that would probably be done through, data analysis on a very high level. So you certainly
Yes.
wouldn't speak with people on the ground. And I suppose that's what makes it very difficult to connect those massive trends, like, for example, inequality or growing
Yes.
inequality or overpopulation or climate change, and something that I need to do for the next year in my warehouse,
Yes, but that's what I was trying to say. You would do a diagnostic that was wide, and we'd have some detailed conversations with the sales guys here. So you would be amassing, a variety of information, and then the next question is, what do we do here and now? So it's
Well,
almost
that's a really difficult leap to make. I mean, how do we do it?
well, there's something about the starting point, which is what are we finding out about this broad context. The what do we do now? So to give you an example of that, supposing an organisation was deciding whether to start to trade in a new country. So you might do this kind of broad country analysis, and you'd be going to reports on human rights or population growth or the level of infrastructure, the competition. That's all pretty good stuff. You'd be working with it slightly differently than with complexity in mind, in that you'd be interested in the kind of past data and the future trends. You'd be trying to look at it all together, and you'd be trying to get people to look at it synergistically. So in other words, if this and this and this are all happening, then wow, that's either a huge opportunity or a huge threat. So you're kind of inviting people to work in a synergistic way to see how these things kind of either make virtuous or vicious circles.
So it's almost like a sensitivity kind of diagnostic as well.
Yes. Then the second bit, which is your, well, how do you make the leap into what to do, is you then go back to the organisation and say, what are we good at? What do we want? Who are we? What's our reputation? What are our characteristics that make us, and is there a kind of attunement with this country picture, let's say, and with what we either want or have? So you might say, well, we are so tuned in to our reputation ethically that we really, despite all the possible rewards of working this country that's got this level of human rights abuses, we can't afford to go there, despite the fact it's a wonderful opportunity. Or you might say, this is the debate you'd have. Well, actually, we can do some good here, so that if we enter, as well as giving goods to people who've never had them before, we can we can shed some good in this situation that we're in. So you're kind of the second bit of it is having this kind of debate about, well, who are we really? What's our intentions? What do we want? What are we good at? What are we bad at? How do we perceive ourselves? And how does that kind of synergize with or not with this opportunity that we've tried to describe? And then the third question, which I think complexity also in an interesting way relates to, is, so how do we then intervene? And that I think that, and not that this is just complexity, but there's something about sometimes there's something about spotting an opportunity that's very specific. So you don't necessarily work systemically, in my view. You kind of go here's an opportunity.
That's looking for cleavages again, right?
Yes, it's like we spotted this guy or this company. This is a real opportunity. We know that politician, and we can really make something work here.
Yeah.
Other times you might be saying, this is so chaotic, we're going to kind of go in light, without many resources, but we're kind of going to try and cohere together some opportunities or people or resources that will, in the slightly longer term, lead to something. So you use your diagnostic to also say, is this a really unformed opportunity, or is this a very locked in, hierarchical, bureaucratic, power, who are the power players? Can we really get into this at all opportunity, or is it somewhere in between? So you're kind of triangulating between what's it like, what are we like, and what do we want? And then how do we, in a sense, spot opportunities, and where are sometimes those opportunities quite specific, you know, quite you know, laser-like, and where sometimes are we kind of building the ground? You know, we're working in a more gentle and, you know, a bit like I was saying about this charity working with disability. We're actually trying to build the ground rather than go in and do something.
Yeah, so making sure that your intervention is commensurate with the nature of that pattern at that point in time.
Yeah,
yeah.
But also, as well as that, but also what you want. You know,
yeah,
so
course, yeah.
Who am I as an organisation? You know, does this suit me? It's no use saying the real opportunity here is this, but that's not what we do.
Yes.
Or this takes this kind of stance and intention, but we don't really think that like that here. So how can we be realistic? How do we marry, you know, who we are? So it's a kind of it is. We're looking both outward in and inward out and trying to marry the two. So when you look at the strategy safari, or, you know, some of the work, sometimes people are very much focused on what is the organisation either good at or wanting to do. Sometimes they're more kind of environmentally driven. This is saying, well, how do you marry those two up, and work both outside in and inside out?
What about the implications of the complexity worldview for management inside the organizations? So how you manage structures, systems, people, because I know you're quite keen to connect different levels.
Yeah. Well, I think so. Where this takes me is you know, and building on what we've just been saying, is what do you have to be like to be successful in this market? So if it's if the market is quite decentralized, and you know, you're working globally, but, you know, Indonesia is just not the same as working in Brazil, for example, then how does your organization form is contingent on the nature of your market, really. So it's a contingency model of organization in part. So, you know, that the kind of, you know, going back to Mintzberg again, you know, how do you kind of think about organisation form in relation to how do you succeed in this market? So if I was a global organisation doing, you know, selling a particular sort of product, and I felt that the market in Indonesia, or the resources in Indonesia, you know, so if I have a global manufacturing strategy that the Indonesian market can't support, you know, it can't afford the plant, or it doesn't have the engineering workers in the country to support it, then, you know, a global technology strategy isn't easily going to work, you know. Or if I assume a level of stability, you know, if I've planned everything with Europe in mind, and I'm now trying to apply this to South America, you know, with a very different kind of, you know, with inflation, you know, and you know, all these things going on, a more volatile a politically volatile situation, then I need to do something differently. So there's something about matching the organisation to the customer, which is, you know, if you don't think about the market and its dynamics, you're not going to succeed. Rather than how do I build this optimal, you know, efficient machine
system,
yeah. So it would be a different answer for different kinds of organisations and markets.
But I suppose one question or one example that I've got in mind. So let's say you've done it, and let's say you're collecting data from different regional offices,
Yes.
and it's all different. And if you really customize it, the data are in a different format, and different indicators matter for different countries. So you have incomparable stuff, right? Or not readily comparable stuff. And let's say you're sitting in the headquarters, and you're getting all of these data flows, all in different formats. You're trying to make sense of it. One example that people often suggest is, well, create a kind of superstructure, like a data processing department or a performance management department that is going to harmonize and kind of make it consistent. What would complexity theory say about that?
Well, I don't know about, yes. I think I'm working at so in my opinion, having seen that kind of thing happen, it usually just complexifies things. It's still working with the idea that things are complicated, but we can get there. And there's issues of power in organisations. So even if they did all that, is anybody actually going to listen to them? Who's actually driving the things? And power is a hugely important issue in organisations and in the world, because power gets locked in and becomes unassailable, and certain things can't be said. And who has power in organisations? But in a more general way, I think if I were, and this has been my advice, in a global organisation where, the dynamics, and people are telling me this, so I speak to people in Brazil, I speak to people in Indonesia, and they're telling me what's going wrong from their point of view. So you can actually, talk to people as well as, analyse information. And so my view of that would be that there needs to be a greater level of decentralisation, so people are more able to respond to their both the markets, but also the resource bases, the skill base, in all sorts of ways. And I think there is a sort of maxim in complexity that because it's a systemic, because you're trying to choose the manufacturing that suits the product, that suits the supply chains, then normally having all your different functions decentralized in a similar way is going to ease that decision making. So I would generally want to decentralize in that case.
And push it back to the context.
And then people would say, well, yes, but then they all go native and it's all kind of a muddle, and then the regional managers have all the power. So there is something about that paradox where you want some expertise, that some people are saying this is good manufacturing practice, this is good IT practice, this is a good way to manage a supply chain. So there's something about that kind of, in a sense, matrix power where there's not no power in those lines, but there's more power to say, how do we really, how do we attune ourselves to the market here? So they would be more like broad principles. And I don't know about you, but all I've seen with that big data stuff is it doesn't really help. It just gets more and more confusing. And
yeah, I'm
not a fan of it. But then I've chosen a particular approach to my work, so I wouldn't be a fan of it. But I think people just don't listen. That if you're the chief executive, I mean, I do it as a consultant sometimes. You only have to have, you talk to people in these different places, and it's not like you take as gospel what they say, but there's other ways of triangulating what people say with more factual data or with other opinions from different places. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's how I think you work organisationally. But you really can't leave out the issue of power, and because otherwise it becomes a kind of idealised process, and power plays a big part in the world, as we know.
Yeah, I'm usually for me, it's not even about big data, but it's about the attempt to kind of control things centrally. And I'm quite skeptical of these control superstructures in general. I was reading an article probably a couple of years ago, written by a university professor who was bemoaning the fact that in universities, there are so many opportunities for faculty to abuse their position in many ways. So in the ways that makes use of their power, for example, so they boss around their PhD students, or they make their PhD students do their work. If they end up on the editorial boards of journals, they can advance their ideas or give preferences to people who are
in their camp.
Whose ideas are kind of consistent with theirs. So I kept reading it, and I kept nodding because obviously you see it, right, in the profession, not massively, but you see these examples, and I kept thinking, okay, so where are you going to lead this? What's the solution? And the solution, one of the solutions that he suggested, was to create an accreditation body that would do kind of ethical audits of universities and kind of stamp out these behaviors or kind of punish the offenders and, that speak. And when I read it, I thought, oh no, there's another superstructure that's going to kind of control.
Yes.
And I was thinking, as you said, it's just going to add another layer of complexity. And it's actually, if anything, it's going to concentrate the power there.
Yes.
And so these people then will be deciding a lot of things.
Yes. And it's a layer of complicatedness. There's nothing generative about it. It is really interesting, and as I've kind of alluded to these kind of political writers a few times, but I think there's something about we do have to kind of explore in some sense human nature, and what being what in our own terms, not ethical in the sense of here's a kind of code of behaviors, but just like how do I act here in some sense that's generative, that if we institutionalize, so it's, I'm now I can hear myself getting incoherent here, but trying to work out what I want to say. But if we allow bad behavior and institutionalize it, so the world is about what you can get away with, then that's what you'll get. It will become more and more instituted. And how do you pick up on that early? How do you challenge yourself? About your own authenticity, for example, or integrity. And it isn't like I'm not talking about some kind of thou shalt do this and thou shalt not do that, but to just have that to kind of in some sense reward or admire or engage with that sense that these people are trying to do their best for others, rather than get away with that kind of more selfish behavior. Now that's part of what I take from complexity, that what enters the system in the end of the day is how you think, feel and act, and that those things can become instituted.
That's really interesting that you say this, because one of the lessons of complexity for me, which you may disagree with, I think, but it actually does resonate with what you've just said. One of the lessons for me is that it actually makes no sense to aim at changing these massive system-wide properties like inequality or climate change or poverty or something like this, because that's an emergent property of a massive system, and you can't really kind of go for it. And I'm reminded of a conversation that I had with a former student who had a PhD in microbiology, and she used to work for a research institute. And she said, well, every once in a while we would have a person who would come in with kind of bright eyes and say, well, I'm here to cure cancer. And she said, well, we would just burst out laughing, because that's not what we're doing here. We're kind of maybe doing some work under that umbrella, but here we're looking at this particular enzyme and its relation to this particular, cell membrane. And what you can do is that, right? Or you could do something really small, or you can, as you said, think about your own behavior and your own ethical choice in relation to, let's say, poverty or climate change. But creating a strategy for changing the climate change processes or the inequality or the poverty, it just makes no sense, because you just don't have that power.
Well, but it depends who you are, doesn't it? It's and who you talk to. So if you're in a position of power, in authority, then you can, as we see so often, that because of the way our structures work, the individuals in the world, you could say the world's run by 10 individuals, that with big global companies and, hugely powerful political leaders, their whims, or their personalities. Now, they may be in a sense themselves an emergent property of a system, as we've discussed before, but nevertheless at that moment in time they have huge power, And look at what happened recently in the UK, where a kind of a particular economic policy, a kind of ideal, harking back to another age and a kind of an idealization of something, creates a sudden drop in, or increase in borrowing rates, the cost of borrowing, which materially affects a whole country, in like 10 minutes, that it takes a day to do that. So, this kind of mantra of, what am I serving? How do I know that what I'm doing? Some people have huge power, some people...
But that doesn't guarantee that in a complex system, their action will produce the desired result, right?
No, but if you take a longer term view that, that the more we just let things go, the more it will go. So it's like inequality. I can just kind of go, well, what can I do about inequality? It's nothing to do with me. I'm quite comfortable. I'll be okay, whatever happens. But what can I do? In what ways do I engage with the system? So there's something about, I think it's different for different levels in the world, but it's just even reflecting on that. It's just like, what am I doing in the longer term? It's what you put into the system. So I think that sounds quite idealistic. I agree.
No, I think that is the answer. I think the answer is partly what you've just said. It's about taking the long-term view, and it's
and sort of the ethical view. I think I do think that, and of course it's true, taking, behaving badly, has, we've only got to look at history, people in a sense behaving selfishly or badly, or killing that lot, or hating this lot, or taking those resources, the whole story of empire, slavery, that the world is writ, in these ways. But what is interesting is to explore, how did we come to end slavery, which we more or less have, how did we end empire, how did we get the votes for women, how do these social changes happen? And it is sometimes about very brave people doing very brave things and standing up for things and opposing things.
But the system has to be, the door has to be open for that, as you said.
Well, sometimes there's something about how do you don't always know if the door's open as well. There's something about, there's everything. Look at, the fall of the Berlin Wall or the end of apartheid. Nobody really saw it coming, and then all of a sudden it's over. So things are kind of crumbling under the surface. They look all right on top, and then, wow, in a matter of days, things collapse. So, there are no easy answers to change in this, and I think about this a lot, and I think for myself, there's something about, my, whatever it means to me, my personal integrity, my authenticity, my desire to think collectively and long term, and to want, a level of social justice. That is me. That's where I'm coming from. But I think that's in kind of the longer term interests of everything. If there's no people, we can't sell things. We're not going to be successful in all sorts of ways. But that drives me. But I think there's also something about the nature of change in a complex world, which is sometimes it's about seizing an opportunity. Sometimes it's about saying no and really opposing something. Sometimes it's about working slowly and inexorably under the radar. Sometimes it's about growing a new example or advertising something that's working well. Do we do enough of that? So I think there's a whole range of change activities that we have to consider, and a lot of it can feel naive, I think, because the big guys with the power do win a lot, and we can't always tackle them head on, but that's my answer. And it's not a convincing answer to everybody. I can imagine people listening to this go, well, that's
I think I believe it. I think it's in the absence of this goal-directed behavior, which doesn't really apply in complex systems, I don't think. You can't really aim at, ending poverty. in the absence of that kind of thinking, you have to base your action on your ethical stance, I think.
Yeah, but I would put it slightly differently. I think I do have an intention to, reduce inequality. That is my intention. And that's what I believe in. And then maybe I seize little opportunities to say something here or show something there.
Well, you do it locally.
Well, and sometimes it's less locally. Sometimes it's like I might make a talk like this, that might go to a lot of people, and I'm saying something that might,
Trigger,
who knows, might trigger
interest,
some, So you don't know sometimes whether you're doing, look at Nelson Mandela, who was 26 years, I think it was, imprisoned, 22 of it on Robben Island in a small cell. He had, no idea that he would do anything other than die there. And, one of the stories, if you go to Robben Island, that they tell is that they had to keep changing the guard that looked after him because they were so kind of affected by who he was, by the way he lived, by the way he treated other people, that it had kind of an impact, so they kind of softened up on him, and then they got the next lot in. And he seemingly, and these are, apocryphal stories, maintained his integrity and his view for 26 years. He had no idea he'd ever survive, never mind be in any position of power, and then all of a sudden he's president of, and
of a new republic,
seeing the end of apartheid. So you never know what you can do and are doing. But there's something about these certain individuals sometimes do change the course of history through, in a sense, through their integrity.
Yeah, and their values. Yeah. And
yes, and I find that interesting. And of course, the opposite is true. We can think of, world leaders who, in the past have done exactly the opposite, who bred hatred and, took a ride on, people's feeling of, being devalued and, creating the idea that it was them that had caused it. So the opposite is true too, but we have a choice. And you never know, I think, how it was like the story with Czechoslovakia. Who would have known when you were doing your little acts of insubordination or your little acts of changing things, that somehow there becomes a kind of networked feel to it, and then there's a power in the people. I think it's absolutely fascinating how retrospectively how change happens. I can remember we had was saying about, we had a complexity elective at Cranfield, and the project I gave people to do was choose a tipping point and look at the history of what led up to that tipping point. What were the antecedents to it? And people did all sorts of things, from the rise of bottled water, which is another kind of weird one, through to the end of apartheid, to all sorts of things. But looking at those kind of antecedents and what ultimately tips the balance is quite interesting, I think.
Yeah, I can imagine, quite revelatory as well.
Yes, yeah.
And you brought me right to my next question, which is how do we teach it? How do we teach these things? I've taught it here at Cranfield, and of course you've taught it all over the world. What does that look like?
Well, it is. There are programs, and I know you're thinking along these lines too, where for example, the University of Cape Town, their executive MBA takes as its kind of core idea the issue of things are interconnected, uncertain. So they drive all their teaching around the kind of ideas that we've been talking about. So with their executive MBA students, they get climate change specialists to come in and talk about the implications of climate change, for the future, where businesses fit into this. So they make a point of teaching people how to think in this kind of more global contextual way. What do regional trade organizations mean for them? So how does government play out, in what in relation to business? So they do a lot of teaching of these kind of big picture things, but they also do a lot of teaching about what it means to be a leader in this world. What is authentic leadership? What are your values? They teach Aristotle and virtue and all sorts of things. So they kind of design their program around the idea that we need to think globally about these big things that affect businesses. We need to think about organisation design. They actually do stuff around organisation design, which hardly anybody does anymore. And they look at the individual as well. So they do personal development.
So it's quite interesting. So it's not just, it's not pure complexity theory, but these are approaches and ideas that resonate with that.
Well, it's a systemic view of emergence, interconnectedness, and working at these different levels. So it kind of informs
the worldview,
it. Yes. And then they do, you know, there's quite a lot of kind of co-teaching. So there's a sort of modelling of being able to, you know, have different perspectives and have conversations, you know, within the classroom, you know, and with people. So it has a different, it doesn't feel like it's teaching people how to get rich and, you know, and make their businesses top.
Yeah.
It has more of a sense of, you know, we're working in organisations which are part of this global ecology, and what should they be doing? What can they be doing? You know, how do we think about the long term and the short term? You know, how do we think about capitalism? You know, how do we think about society? So it gets people to reflect on very many different levels. So in a sense, I do some of what I do there is, which includes, you know, doing a session on what can we learn from Daoism, you know, which is just fabulous, and the kind of engagement with students there, you know, how that kind of dynamic works. So I don't get the feeling of, you know, I'm an entertainer. I'm supposed to entertain them. I feel like it's a co-inquiry. You know, that they're sincere, and there's a kind of, you know, kind of engagement with me, and a kind of, you know, the yes buts are kind of really about, I really want to understand this, or have you thought of this?
That's very rewarding.
Yes.
Yeah, I know it from experience.
Yeah. So it doesn't feel like I have to be, you know, funny, or, you know, hopefully I'm sometimes funny, but, you know, I don't have to perform to a kind of audience, you know, going, well, okay, entertain me.
You don't need to please people. Please the customers.
They work hard, I think. You know, and I kind of wonder whether in some ways that, you know, that us in the North have got a bit cynical, a bit moribund, you know, greedy, complacent, you know, and whether some of the, you know, the global South will provide a kind of thought leadership and
new energy.
Yes, and new approaches and ideas, you know, because they're starting in a very different place, you know, and you know, so it's exciting, you know, just energetically it's exciting, you know, to work with them.
So you've worked in this field for a couple of decades now. More? Okay.
Yes.
What would you say is your kind of biggest impact on this field and your biggest contribution so far?
I think this emphasis on what is the complexity ontology, and I think because I've been able to span a number of worlds, and although I don't do simulations and mathematical models, I think with my background I can kind of understand what's going on and interrogate it. So I can kind of span, you know, I've worked in social science, I've worked in management, I've been a management consultant, I've been, you know, a manager in business, you know, I'm quite engaged with my local community too. So shining the complexity lens on all of that all the time, and having this kind of, as I was saying, this kind of dialogic between the ideas and the practice, and well, does this really work here? I don't just mean work in the sense of is it effective, but I mean, does it resonate? You know, do these ideas play out? Do I see them? Does this go, oh yes, that's a good way of understanding this? So I feel my breadth, probably, and my breadth of interests and experiences have helped to really kind of express and home in on this idea of the importance of our worldview. How do we surface our worldview, and what does it mean to hold this worldview? Is something I feel I've been able to contribute, and in some ways having I came from a kind of largely, a northern working class background where my parents did well in business, but weren't educated. I didn't come from a kind of middle class educated background, so I got used to having to explain complex things in straightforward terms, because otherwise nobody. Well, my mother just used to say, "Tell me again what complexity is." We did have that conversation, but I think that kind of background has helped in the description and the articulation of some of this, and so that I think that kind of the issue about how do you articulate this in the world view. I think my interest in this, what we've called ontological resonance, just to kind of float around, Daoism and Buddhism and things like that, and kind of go, look, here's quantum gravity and here's Daoism. Aren't they similar? Hey guys, isn't this interesting? Has been something I'm able to do to a degree, because I can kind of bury around in the science and the philosophy and the kind of social science, I think. So I think that's something I've contributed, and I think it is probably obvious in the way that I'm speaking, is that I do, in a sense, and this is me talking about me as a person, I want to make the world a better place. I'm not really here to be rich and famous. I worry about inequality and the future of and these big issues, but also locally, what can we do locally? I'm engaged with my local community and all that kind of thing. So I do think that complexity thinking informs my personal and individual ethical stance. It is like it's why I'm not sure. I think you do need to have intentions about inequality, or
about big things.
Yes, it's how you do it is sometimes very local and particular and small sometimes, and sometimes it's bigger, but complexity thinking does inform everything I do. It is like it isn't like a lens I put on it. It's a lens that has become me.
It is the worldview.
For me, it is. I inhabit it, and I do. That doesn't mean to say I don't kind of interrogate bits of it and think, well, I wouldn't say that like that now. So when I look back to some of the writing here,
so it's not an ideology, but
Well, no. Well, I suppose it probably is, inevitably, isn't it? But it's an ideology. It's a kind of ideological. It's an ideology that there's no ideology in some ways. But yeah. So perhaps I think what I find sometimes in my teaching, which I find really interesting, is people are touched by my authenticity and my willingness to share who I am, not just in terms of personal stories, but just, I think, something about showing myself as living and working and in the complex world, and what that means to me seems to affect people. So sometimes it is about, to a degree, what I am or what I represent, as well as kind of this is an intellectual discourse, that I think I offer. Not that I'm the only person to do that, but that does matter to me. I think there's something about authenticity that actually changes the system. I've used the system word, more than having an idea and trying to convince people. It's like being something, showing something. Is important.
Embodying it.
Embodying, that's a word. Yeah.
But obviously, you're not done yet. You're still thinking about it. You're writing a new book. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Yes. It's probably going to be called The Tao of Complexity, which kind of tells you a lot. And I'm trying to write it in almost like in a way that's reminiscent of the Tao Te Ching, which is writing it in short sections that are kind of relatively self-contained and deepen aspects of this thinking in a variety of ways. So it's in sections. So some of it I've written, some quite, hopefully accessible but quite tricky stuff about indeterminism in science. Why am I saying science is indeterminate not deterministic. You know, what is quantum mechanics saying about the relational worldview? So it's got bits that are like that, or, you know, how is pragmatism? You know, what is pragmatism? How does it relate to this? So there are sections on science. There are sections on philosophical ideas. There are sections on ways of knowing. So how do we know about this complex world? There are sections on what does this mean for our understanding of the way the brain works, or what does it mean for, you know, how we think about hope, which is a sort of intention, you know. So I'm trying to take things, and sometimes I get, you know, I read something in the newspaper, which was to do with a journalist writing about the Philippines, and you know, some of the kind of ways power has immersed there. So I will take something like that, and then I'll kind of play with it. It's a bit like, well, if I understand this through the lens of complexity, what would I be learning? And it's been incredibly interesting for me as I've tried, you know, I've started to sort of unpick, for example, the difference between a focus on self-organizing and self-regulating, and this idea of how change happens and how things flow and new things emerge, you know. So it kind of it sort of picks out different aspects of it for me. And my hope is that somebody might go, oh, I can't be bothered with quantum physics, you know, but I'm interested in what she's saying about ways of knowing, or I'm interested in another sort of philosophy, or I'm interested in the practice of how we deal with trauma, for example, you know, that we have locked in patterns, not just in societies, but in ourselves, you know. So how do you understand that and unpick that, you know, how does that fit in with this? So it's pretty ambitious. And
it sounds like a book of connections, right? Of
yes,
things that are connected.
Yes, and which interrogate things in deep ways. And I'm trying to kind of network the book, as opposed to, say, read it from beginning to end.
Yes.
And, you know, write things in a way that would make you think. You know, it would say, oh, you know, I haven't thought about self-organization like that before. So that's my hope, is that it deepens people's appreciation and understanding of this field, and connects it to what they read in the papers or what they do tomorrow with their family or their community. So that's what I'm trying to do. So, and I think for me that my contribution is about sort of deepening understanding and finding in all that something that moves you to say, well, maybe I'll try that differently. I'm still a, you know, I'm working in performance management. I'm a leader here, you know, I'm in my community here, but I'm going to try this out, or I find myself seeing it slightly differently now. That would be my hope. That this book,
so not just a book of connections, but also a book that could kind of spark the flame. Yes. Here and there, depending on which chapter you read and what's interesting for you and relevant for you at that point in time.
Yes, spark the flame and deepen understanding. Yeah, because these, you know, a lot of this people, oh, I've got that, you know, self-organization, you know, and my living with these ideas over nearly 3 decades now, you know, it's changed me, and I'm still learning, and and because I see it in a way about my own way I want to see myself in the world and contribute to the world, you know. So you know, like on my gravestone, I don't really want to say, you know, here was Jean, she was clever, or, you know, she was successful. I want it to say, here lies Jean, you know, she deepened our sense of community and caring and interconnection, and played a little tiny bit in making the world a slightly better place for more people. That is, you know, that I might use complexity to get there, but that's saying something about me. But it has deepened my conviction that at the end, you know, that is what matters really, and what will, you know, what will make this world succeed in a way that, if we're not careful, you know, if we destroy our habitats and each other, and, you know, have completely out of control climate change, you know, huge wars, immigration, migrants, you know, if we're not careful, you know, we run the risk of, you know, making a future that's not sustainable. So I think it's both selfishly in our interests as well as anything else.
Okay. So we've spoken for about 2 hours now.
Yes, yes.
do you want to leave us with an idea or an insight or a question that's based on this view?
I think, you know, partly it's, I don't think I can say this very pithily, but there's that if the world is, if this rings true, you know, if I try this out on people. I remember doing a lecture like, you know, along these lines in East London to a charity that was working with the social determinants of health in you know, the hard to reach communities. So there were Bengali, Somali, Turkish, Kurdish, and, you know, people in dire poverty who were there. So very ordinary people, and I'm chirruping on in my, you know, general fashion. And I stood in the queue for the food and listened with rapture to this Bengali woman explaining to this Somali woman what I'd said and why it was important. And that's success for me, you know, and they got it because they live in a complex world. You know, it isn't like, you know, they're sanitized from that nasty complexity. You know, they had lived it, you know, they recognize what I was saying. So I think there's something about just really notice the world you live in and try it on for size. You know, does this complexity worldview, is it true? You know, is it useful? You know, is it true whether we like it or not, or isn't it? You know, what does it, and then I think the second question is, what do you want to be then when you grow up? You know, what are you becoming? What do you see as your legacy? You know, what do you want to, you know, how do those two things go together? You know, how do you see the future for your great grandchildren? You know, how do you want to perceive yourself in relation to that, and how therefore do you want to act? I think that's perhaps what I would, you know, like to leave it with. Thank you.
Fantastic. Jean, thank you very much.
Thank you for asking me. I've enjoyed it.
Fantastic.
Okay.